and welcome to the Courtenay Turner podcast. We have a fantastic, fascinating episode planned for you today. One of my favorite thinkers, researchers, authors, and filmmakers, my friend Matt Ehret, will be returning to the show. But before we introduce him, I want to tell you all about the Cognitive Liberty Conference. It is cognitivelibertyconference.com. This is going to be in Nashville, Tennessee, August 16th and 17th. And it's a 2-day event. We have both in-person tickets as well as live stream options for you. I do recommend, if you can make it to Nashville, Tennessee, it is going to be an exquisite rooftop venue. You probably won't want to miss it. If you have the opportunity to get here, I highly recommend you do. You're going to be with some incredible people. It is a private location, so that location will only be disclosed to those people who have purchased the ticket. But if you can't make it in person, we do have the live stream option for you. You'll see when you go to the ticketing options on the website, there is an option to buy a 1-day live stream or a 2-day. The 1-day is $17.76. And I just thought that would be, capturing the essence of what we're doing here. But if you buy the 2 days, it's a great deal at $25, kind of a no-brainer. So it is just as it sounds. Cognitive liberty is what we're trying to instill. The first day is a focus on education. So we're going to go through what the history of education and how they are, as Charlotte Iserbyt calls it, deliberately dumbing down America. And John Taylor Gatto had a very similar title for his book. So we're going to go through that history, what their end goals are, and what we can do to instill creative, independent thought processes in our youth. And then day 2 is going to be a focus on cognitive liberty as a defense against the political and psychological dialectical warfare. And that sounds kind of like a mouthful, but we have phenomenal guests who are going to break it down and explain how this is happening in very real, practical, application right now. So if those of you who have seen the episode I did with Dr. James Lindsay, Jay Dyer, and Stephen Coughlin, this will be kind of an expanded version of that. And we are adding to the roster now Michael O'Fallon as well as Dr. John Gentry. So both days, all of the speakers will be doing a little presentation, and then we will have roundtable discussion following that. And those who are in person as well as online will have an opportunity to submit their questions to the panelists and to me if you wish. So, and we are also seeking sponsors, and those of you who want to sponsor can do so directly through the site. And those will have an opportunity to join myself and the speakers for dinner on the rooftop location. So check it out, cognitivelibertyconference.com. And again, that is in Nashville, Tennessee, August 16th, 17th. And as always, any support for the podcast and the work we're doing is greatly appreciated. So you can head on over to CourtenayTurner.com. That's spelled like Courtenay, COURTENAY, TURNER.com. And also you can just like the show, smash the like button, share it with those you think might be interested. And I won't ramble on for too much longer. I will bring on Matt Ehret. How are you doing today?
Hello, Courtney. I'm doing very well. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Yeah, so glad to have you back. And I am so curious about this. You had mentioned this to me, and I've done quite a bit of research on Kurt Lewin because of Tavistock and National Training Labs and the NEA and, of course, sensitivity training. I did a whole episode on that, the brainwashing tactics. But I didn't even realize that I know he called himself a Gestalt psychologist, but I didn't realize that there was a difference between Gestalt psychology and Gestalt therapy. And I had no idea that he was involved in subverting either one. So yeah. How did you come about that? Like to find that?
Yeah, no, it's a really important little nuance to make, because sometimes people tend to throw out the baby with the bathwater, and they don't realize the reason why the oligarchy is effective is because they're good at stealing things that are discovered by people who think like normal, natural, creative humans pursuing discoveries about the universe and our place and purpose within said universe. So the oligarchy doesn't have it within their cultural matrix, as far as I could tell, to make those discoveries. There's nothing within that toxic, culture of grooming your children, breaking them of their humanity and their conscience through Eton and boarding schools and ritual,
they're great at destroying. They're not so great at creating.
sophistication to it. There's a you know, it's impressive in a disgusting way.
Yes, yes.
But part of their effectiveness is, like I was mentioning, to steal things and then co-opt and use them for their own benefit and not for the purpose that those said discoveries were originally made for. In the minds of those great scientists or artists who brought something online. And we saw like a good example of that being co-opted in the beauty of the Renaissance, right? And how so many discoveries were occurring in a very high density fashion coming out of the Dark Age period of the collapse of so much of the population numbers across Europe and even globally. It was devastating. That whole period of feudal Dark Age, forever wars, people forgot things during the Dark Age. But then there was this burst of discoveries in science and architecture, in beauty, in the arts, music, polyphonic music began to be developed. Everything was just a domain of awe and discovery. However, we could see that just after a few generations into the 15th century, 16th century, a lot of those techniques that were innovated artistically to produce great beauty became co-opted by a lot of these Neoplatonists that you and I have talked about in the past, these hermetic Kabbalists and perverse occultists who would like to, they saw the value in the rigor of the science and the arts, but then they turned it into eroticism. So a lot of the, not all of, but a lot of the Renaissance beauty is contaminated with subject matter that is, you could just see it in a lot of the paintings of erotic sensualism that is very seductive because of the intensity of the beauty that it expresses, but it doesn't carry with it the moral development of character that one should expect from great art. And that's the same thing for a variety of perversions within the music sector as well. And I think this sort of gets at the Kurt Lewin thing, because Kurt Lewin was somebody who, as you've pointed out in your previous presentations, was very closely aligned with the Frankfurt School, with people like Ehret Tristet at Tavistock as well.
Yeah, he was a Frankfurt School refugee who ended up in Tavistock. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. This convergence of just two different aspects of the most sophisticated aspect of the empire per se, and the Frankfurt School that it was immersed within, and I think really carried its philosophy deeply within his heart. I don't know at what point he became a misanthropic bastard, but it happened along the way. And he found like real soul brothers, not that they believed in the soul, amongst George Lukács and Erich Fromm and these other
actually Wilhelm Wundt, who was a huge influence on them, specifically says there is no soul. And that's why he was okay with treating human beings as lab rats, essentially, and created the experimental psychology, because there's no soul. So it's not like, it's just automatons.
Yep. And these guys were all put to work. Theodor Adorno, all these creatures, they were all absorbed in the 1930s. They were all given posh, new, very influential appointments in MIT, in Chicago, in Stanford, in New School, especially, and a lot of this was facilitated by John Dewey and the whole Fabian Society crowd embedded within America around Walter Lippmann and that whole crew. So they were really facilitating the flow of these agents into the United States, and they became the bedrock of the intellectual sort of guiding lights of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the entire decision and program to create modern art, abstract art, atonalism, like this cult of ugliness in high art that would be different from the basic banality of repetitive rhythms repeatedly intoned for the banal art of the masses. That was overseen by people like Theodor Adorno, a massive music scholar, hugely influential to this very day in Juilliard and other things. But he was a member of this crew, and they were of the view that no, we have to create two cultures: a culture for the managerial elite of ugliness, people who can drop a few $100 million on abstract, ugly art being funded by the CIA. Right, which definitely has an effect on your minds and morals if you start just immersing yourself in that type of irrationalism. And then a cult of sensualism, of banality, for the masses who would be expected not to develop a concentration span, only listen to music that had maybe a 3 to 4 minute duration. No more music.
The Billy Joel song, right? If you want to have a hit, you got to make it fit. So we cut it down to 305.
Yeah,
Strong the
exactly.
entertainer. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an unfortunate but very true statement. That's the formula. Um, and it did create like the two cultures, a more manageable culture for the, but neither one of them, I think, was really at the level of the control well, the high culture of those who were being shaped by the abstract ugliness were themselves just being shaped by shapers, and these shapers get you more closer to Tavistock people like Lewin, like Ehret. What we got? Yeah, there you go. There you go. Jackson Pollock. Yep,
Yeah.
with his random paint splatterings selling for hundreds of millions of dollars. Yep,
Crazy.
that stuff. And people started like modulating their taste to that. So just like I was saying with the Neoplatonic perversion of the Renaissance,
Mhm.
art is the battlefield. It's a major battlefield, and the direction you take with art is justified by your ideas of what you think science is. It's also both of those two domains of science and art are very much shaped by what you think the human mind is and what its purpose is. So it's all very much connected, which is why these high level psychiatrists, these social manipulators at Tavistock, which is sort of the psychiatric warfare branch of the British Empire, were founded.
Outgrown from the British Propaganda Bureau. So yeah, literally.
Totally, yeah, and the town of Bedford, where Tavistock exists, was the town that's owned by the Earl of Bedford, and which is otherwise the Russell family.
Yes.
Bertrand Russell, Lord John Russell, that whole thing was there for 400 years as the Russell family domain, with their little weird town symbol of a sheep getting like on a hook, getting spin. That's like the official town symbol, which I think has something to do as a bit of a tongue-in-cheek with the Fabian Society logo.
I think so too. Well, most of the members were Fabians, the early members
Of the Tavistock?
Yeah. The British Propaganda Bureau, like almost all of them were Fabians.
That's true. H.G. Wells.
Yeah. H.G. Wells. Who else was it?
Rudyard Kipling,
Doyle, Arthur
Conan
right?
Doyle was not a
Doyle.
Fabian, but he was with the Society for Psychical Research, which was tied to
kind of
Tavistock.
a predecessor. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I'm blanking on who else it was, but I know they invited Rudyard Kipling, but he couldn't make it, but he was tied in with Fabian.
Okay.
I probably have the whole list, but there were several, especially in that initial, before they even started, when they did that like whole consortium of the writers who they brought to do all the propaganda that they kept secret until 1935. But the majority of them were Fabian or Fabian adjacent.
Yeah, so that would make perfect sense that that symbol right there of the wolf and sheep
clothing. That's at the literal coat of arms for the Fabian. Yeah,
exactly, commissioned by George Bernard Shaw, and that would very much be complementary to the Tavistock logo of the town of Bedford, of the town of Tavistock, which also was where Hitler was conditioned back in 1911, 1912 with Rudolf Hess. So there was already something before the Tavistock Clinic was set up in 1920. There was already this occult, because this is always tied to the occult, the New Templar.
And for those who don't know, the Russell family is who started Skull and Bones, right? The Russell Trust made Skull and Bones.
I don't know if there's a connection between the American branch or the American Russells and the Lord Russells of the British. There probably is a connection, but I haven't discovered what that is yet. But
I don't have it in front of me, but this in Sutton's book, The American Secret Establishment, The Order of Skull and Bones, he goes through it.
Right? He does? That would be amazing for me. I'd love to discover that there's a direct connection of those two families in America and England. I'd love to know that.
Okay.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. Yeah, that's their official symbol right there. Okay. Good job. Right.
Oh, and how interesting, the red and the blue. Is that in the original also?
I don't probably.
Or is that just a pictorial representation? Like, did they just color that in? If that's the original with the red and blue, that's very interesting.
Probably is the original. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, the lion has, I mean, we don't have to go into a symbolic discussion at the moment, but there is a lot to unpack with that too. But back to the issue of
yeah, sorry.
The science of mind, aka the new field of psychiatry. That's another version of it, right?
Yeah.
So you got the burgeoning field, because before that, there wasn't, psychiatry is kind of a new field. Right. It was only at the end of the 19th century that there was the idea that, okay, there's a mind-brain relationship that can be explored through things that Wilhelm Wundt is doing by discovering certain neurological expressions of different aspects of sensory stimulation, you know, that there's parts of the brain, and some of that is useful, you know, that the olfactory part of the brain does smell, and you get the visual cortex, and you can like kind of map out and get a better. There's a usefulness to elements of this, but the overarching philosophy that Wilhelm Wundt was bringing into the study of the mind-brain relationship was sick as hell, because as you pointed out, he ideologically rejected metaphysics, meaning he rejected the ideas of the soul, of God, of anything that is beyond the physical, sensual, measurable, material senses and material world. And anything outside of that, he rejected. So he largely was part of the Vienna Circle, which Kurt Lewin was also incubated in, of people like Mach. Yeah.
Sorry, no. Go on. Yeah, talk about that. I was just going to mention that, speaking of the occult, Wilhelm Wundt's grandfather was Kirchner Casimir Karl Wundt, and it was the provincial report in Utica provincial report reports his name as being Raphael in the Illuminati.
Interesting. I know that. That's interesting. Okay. Yeah. All right. Duly noted. I said the plot thickens.
The plot thickens, yeah. The Vienna Circle is fascinating. There's a great book. I read it in high school and I never forgot it. It was Bread and Wine, and it was all about the Vienna Circle.
Okay. And they treated it well. Like there was a good understanding of what this.
You know, that's where all the culture germinated and all the art, and so they did. They painted a very like romanticized picture of the Vienna Circle. I'd like to read it now. I'd probably have a very different lens on it, but
probably. Well, definitely. I mean, there were some good people within the Vienna Circle at different times. Like, what's his name? Einstein's buddy Kurt Gödel was a member, but he was like a dissident member. The Vienna Circle overall was really organized around the rejection of metaphysical concepts and the attempt to sort of impose radical positivism, which is just sort of like radical, a mixture of radical Aristotelianism mixed in with radical Baconianism. So sensualism tied to a belief that there are these absolute unexaminable rules that we have to assume exist a posteriori, a la Aristotle, when we interpret reality or try to map out reality, and then just have our senses helping us out in that mixture. But the idea, again, of justice, which you can't smell or see or taste, or virtue or freedom, it's meaningless, unscientific to the followers of Ernst Mach and the Vienna Circle as a whole.
Right.
So very much schismed in that sense. And so Kurt Gödel was cool because he was coming in as like a classically trained Christian who really believed in his and understood the necessity of the soul, because he made discoveries, and he's the one who then disproved Bertrand Russell's thesis that that everything in the universe could be sort of reduced down to a limited array of axioms and postulates tied to symbolic formulae that could then give us the power of gods, or Laplace's demon, to foresee everything that would ever happen and everything that could ever happen. And that was the Bertrand Russell thesis with Whitehead in the Principia, which Gödel overthrew completely in his incompleteness theorem. So just to say some nuance, there were some good people emerging through there. But okay, so the convergence of the battle over the arts and culture and the battle over the mind, very, very much the same thing for the, in the mind of the oligarchy. And so, as you pointed out in the introduction, we see how Gestalt psychology has been used very effectively by the Tavistockians, who have done so much damage to human society with a lot of, and as I'm going to do today in a few slides I put together a couple of hours ago.
Okay.
Introduce what is the Gestalt school that Kurt Lewin learned from, and then soul to soul and some Faustian bargain to the devil in order to deploy those insights for evil. So
Yeah.
That's Kurt Lewin right there. Yep, that's Kurt Lewin right there. And he was very much a cyberneticist. He was very much a game theorist. He very much promoted this idea of field theory, or the idea that we have to learn as social engineers from the domain of physics and apply physics to managing human systems, right?
Topological psychology, he called it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Topological psychology, knowing that there's certain vector dynamics, there's certain principles that organize group behavior, a tendency to adapt by the individuals within the group, the tendency for the individuals to be shaped by what the group thinks. And so these were all like mechanisms as levers that could be very useful for people shaped or trained to be the alphas within the caste system, you know? And that's what
Change agents is what he called them.
what did he call them?
Change agents.
Change agents. Yeah. Got that term from John Rawlings Rees. I'll show a little quote from Rawlings Rees too. So why don't we just start the slide?
Rees was a character too.
Yeah. So for most people who don't know what Gestalt psychology is, this is going to be a quick primer, a very quick primer, and the books that I'm going to be drawing from primarily are Wolfgang Köhler's Gestalt Psychology, as well as Wolfgang Köhler's Place of Value in a World of Facts, and Kurt Köfke's Gestalt Psychology as well. So those are some of the books, as well as Max Wertheimer's Dialogues with Albert Einstein. So we'll do a little thing there.
Oh, okay.
These are some of the people I was just mentioning. The founding fathers of this school are listed there primarily. Kurt Lewin was trained by the guy on the left. At a certain point, he was brought in, I think, in a similar way that Aristotle was brought into Plato's academy when Plato was an old man, to learn some of the arts of epistemological development that Plato was innovating. Aristotle, as a young infiltrator, was brought in, learn, and then subvert Plato's method. I sense a sort of similar thing with Kurt Lewin being deployed into these networks, acting like he was an honest student, and then doing his own thing. Whether he was always corrupt from the get-go, I don't know. Probably was. But so
I mean, my suspicion, I mean, obviously I don't know, but my suspicion is that when they, you know, I mean, there's one, he was recruited through so many different channels, you know, like he goes from the Frankfurt School to Tavistock. I mean, a lot of them did. There were these, a lot of quote unquote refugees or overlap, but I think you kind of make a deal, you know, it's like, okay, we'll prop you up and we'll make you a refugee. We'll save you, but now you're owned by us and you have to play by our rules. And I think then they lure you with whatever kinds of, you know, they propped him up. Obviously, there was power, there was money. I mean, the Naval Research Institute gave him, wait, is that what it's called? Yeah, Naval Research. They brought him in. The MIT brought him in to do the group dynamics. Who else was it? Obviously National Training Labs, and the Navy gave him money for that. And then he started the National Training Lab in 1947, and then also the National Association of Education also, you know, put him in a very high position. So I feel like he got all of these, you know, status symbols and leadership roles, and I'm sure there was lots of money and fame and stuff tied to that as well. So yeah,
absolutely. No, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and but these were all things that he benefited from after he sort of had been sent into school that was happening a little bit before World War I. Or no, that was actually a little after World War I. Right. That was in the 20s.
Yeah.
And then, he impressed Eric Trist. Eric Trist just put a bunch of his theories into practice regarding group dynamic manipulation, especially on labor unions and infiltrating and subverting labor unions in Britain, and then in the United States more broadly. And all that stuff you just said, absolutely. And there's always evidence of very powerful hands helping him and directing his career the whole time. So let's go back to the slide.
Yeah, go back to slide.
Okay. So there's just the image of some of those founders. Kurt Köfke, the guy on the right there, is a classical violinist. Another co-founder, Max Wertheimer, very close friends with Albert Einstein and many of the leading scientists. You got to keep in mind that the environment contextually that these people are operating within is high discovery. It's a world of discoveries. Madame Curie had just made her discoveries. New elements were being discovered on the periodic table. The whole universe of the atom was being opened up through Max Planck's discovery. The ideas of Einstein were having a direct application to discovering lasers, the subtleties of the curvature of physical space-time. A whole bunch of things that were bearing fruit technologically that were helping us overcome the limits to growth and demonstrating that the thesis of mathematicians like Bertrand Russell were absolutely wrong, because Bertrand Russell, like all of those who think like him, denied the efficient existence of human creativity as an agency of transformation within both the human but also the universal domain. They reject that, hence no metaphysics. So, but that was happening. The evidence was showing us that there was this reciprocation between the universe, the discovery process of certain people who develop themselves and have a love of discovery. There was a reciprocation of the individual, the personality, the brain of the individual that is receiving and pursuing discoveries, and their eureka moments, which transform the entire potential of society as a whole to be able to have more people at a higher quality of life. The whole Malthusian trap is broken as soon as you do those things, right? So this is the type of world that these guys are living in, which is why they're also very closely aligned with the best cutting edge scientists, the ones making discoveries, not the ones subverting discoveries, because there's two sciences at war with each other too. And we'll say a word about that.
Yeah.
So what is Gestalt psychology in short? The Gestalt is a German term meaning a whole that's more than the sum of its parts in the simplest term. So it's the study of wholes that are more than the sum of their parts in both spatial, physical, and temporal aspects. You have also the recognition that subjectivity and objectivity must not be broken apart. So we're going to say a word about that. That creativity and discovery-oriented attention to mind-brain perceptions has to be the focus of the science of Gestalt psychology. It's not therapeutic, like, oh, I'm so anxiety-ridden, I'm not able to, get a job, I'm self-sabotage. It's not so much that, although it would make you a better person to study it. It's not based on that type of impact therapy of that sort. It's not, that's not what it was designed more to look at. Well, what is the human mind and what does it do and why is it? That was the core questions that formed the school. Because it's like these guys that were the dominant schools of thought were in the world of Max Wertheimer and especially Kurt Köfke and Wolfgang Köhler being my favorite of the three. The dominant theories of mind that everybody had to calibrate themselves to if you wanted to be scientifically respected were primarily being shaped at that time by the behaviorist school that figure on the left of B.F. Skinner, who was also very much tied later on to Esalen and a lot of things. But that school pretty much was of the view that your internal subjective feelings are not scientific. They don't matter. Your who you are as a person and what you will do is entirely shaped by the behavior, which is shaped by your environment, which itself will be shaped by the social engineers or zookeepers who control your environment. That was the one option. The other option was the introspectionist school with Freud, Sigmund Freud, as the godhead of the introspective school, which was sort of the polar opposite. And it's a false dichotomy. And in the introspectionist school, the only thing which is seen as valid for the Freudian is what you feel, the symbolic dreams you have, the internal world of subjectively matters, but everything external doesn't really shouldn't be respected scientifically so much in the Freudian introspectionist school. So it's all one or all the other, and whole careers were built around one of those two. And it's in that type of battle around these false dualisms that the Gestalt school had to be created by the founders who were trying to resolve this fallacy. So rather than, like we can all agree that this is a book, maybe a very overly read book, but we wouldn't necessarily agree that it's all purple. Some people might, the consensus might say purple. Some might say red or pink, or I don't know. I mean, maybe it's more pink. I don't know. Now that I look at it, it's like a dark pink. So, but then you could say, additionally, every eye is different. There's no two eyes that are identical, and maybe there's a slight differential in everybody's eye regarding what frequencies their retina is picking up. And so you could say that no two pinks are alike, being from the standpoint of perception. Now, the introspectionist would be thus inclined towards total relativity. Thus, there is no real truth because everybody's perceptions are uniquely their own. Everybody's feelings are uniquely their own. So there's infinite truths as much as there are infinite feelings or infinite perceptions of things, and thus there is no truth. Versus behaviorists who would say all that's real is what we say is real, but the perceptions of the people receiving states of whether it's sound or visual waves into the eye, whatever, it doesn't matter. And in that sense, perception or truth is also relative because it's based entirely upon the will of the stronger to impose their definition of reality onto the masses, onto the weak, which is again a form of relativity, although it's just more totalitarian in its flavor, but it's still two sides of the same relativity. So Gestalt psychologists were more looking at, well, what are the evidence of what we can know about what the mind does? What is this thing called mind that everybody is looking at? And one of the things that they spend a lot of time doing is how the mind looks for whole. It imposes, it looks for order out of chaos. There's a lot of examples in Curler's works and all of them about where they give concrete case studies where, what do you see, Courtney, looking at this thing?
This thing?
Yeah, this thing I'm showing you right now. What do
you
I mean, here?
It looks like, well, there's many things. I mean, if you look at it as a whole, I guess you could say it's got a star that has like Pac-Man circles on three corners. You could say it's a consortium of various triangles that are overlapped. One that's, white, the other one has an outline. You could say that it's two triangles, that one triangle is on top of three circles.
Yeah. And yet, visually speaking, if you were a robot, because you're a human being looking at that and looking, you're seeing triangles that are clearly not there. Like a robot would respond saying, that's clearly an absurdity. These are three broken lines at 50-degree angles or whatever. No, it's 60-degree angles and three Pac-Man images. And that's all there is, really. It's just, that's all you got. But the mind will see the things that you just pointed out. We're looking to fill the gaps. So the mind fills gaps. Another example here, right? It's like, are we looking at my mind would honestly see a box, a cube in front of a bunch of circles. That's what I think everybody's mind would tend to go there, unless you were like, maybe a radical autist or something. But otherwise, that's what it is. But literally what it is just, a bunch of 8 broken circles and, or not even broken circles. Yeah, you could say broken circles. And that's it. Right.
They kind of look like weird peace signs, but
little
asymmetrical peace signs.
A couple of arrows.
Yeah.
But the mind first goes to the cube. More fun one here is like, what are we seeing?
This is funny.
Yeah, it is. So you're seeing
like the faces, the guy playing the guitar. Yeah, there's all sorts of different things going on there.
Yeah, there's clearly two different ways of looking at the thing. It's one thing, but you're seeing the guy playing a guitar with another person sitting next to them in under some arch, and a lady listening in on the background, and the other, you could just shift your focus, and all of a sudden you see 2 old people embracing, with the lady becomes the ear, and it still makes sense.
Yeah, sure.
But it's a question of now free will. What did we willfully choose to give our attention to that changes how our mind interprets what is otherwise? And I mean, if you were a logic, like a complete computer, you might just see a slab logically of color tones, and what appears to be order might actually be defined around some, like, what is this? Well, it's a bunch of paint splatterings with an orange tone there at this like frequency of 682 nanometers with a gradient down to 400 nanometers. And, you might just give some stupid mathematical description of the thing. But a human the human mind is wired differently. So these are the sorts of examples that the Gestalt psychologists are looking at, just to see, well, what is the mind? Why they're asking questions like, well, why is it that we take joy in solving puzzles, but we don't take joy in starting with a puzzle and then breaking up into random bits? So there's things like that give us an instinct on how to think about this. Some of the core principles that they codify in the course of developing this as a science involve certain laws that are described at length, involving the proximity principle, that elements which are close together seem to be a group. So exactly that exact demonstration is a fine one. That there's a bunch of blue dots that are slightly separated from another smaller batch of blue dots, right? That are then categorized as two ones. We could choose to look at it all as one thing. Right. The whatever teal shapes with the other two sets of blue dots. We could look at all as one, or our mind will be inclined to separate them based upon their proximity to each other as groups. The other one is what I just alluded to, that closure, the human brain ignores gaps and tries to understand the bigger context. So we are a context-oriented species. Important to think about. It seems self-evident for us because we're always like looking at context and causation, but it's philosophically, there's implications to what that means as well, just to chew on. The principle of similarity, that elements which look similar seem to be a group. So even though this is one group, they're all together proximally, but based on color and shape, we would still tend to categorize these as two, as different groups, of the purple hexagons and the teal circles. Common region, elements which are close together seem to be a group. I feel like that's very close to proximity. Anyway.
Yeah.
Continuity.
Not a whole lot of difference there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little bit weird. Anyway, continuity, elements which are ordered in a line or curve seem to be a group. So, rather than a spattering here on the right, those that have a curvature or a line when they're arranged that way seem to all have one identity. So we'll give these, though they're all the same thing, they're all circles, we'll give those on the bottom the identity of participating in curvature, whereas the ones on the top, we'd give the identity of participating in straightness. And these ones here on the right, we'd give the identity perhaps of participating in randomness. But the identity, the qualitative identity, is what our mind is imposing onto interpreting what the visual experience is that we're getting from our senses and that's being received into our brain, right? Figure and ground, the human brain instinctively recognizes if something is in the fore or background. That's an interesting one, right?
Yeah.
I don't know about you. Which one are you picking up between these two elements within this symbol as being in the fore versus background?
Like the arrow inside the triangle or the lines underneath it? The circles underneath it?
Yeah, like, well, do you sense that this green thing is in front of the purple thing?
That's what it looks like to me, but I mean, obviously it's two-dimensional, so but my eye goes to the green arrow first.
My mind does as well. The darker one is a secondary consideration for my eye.
Yeah.
I would say that the majority of people would probably answer something similar to.
Well, I think also because not just because of the color and the placement, but the fact that the green makes the shape of an arrow, so we can label it as something, whereas the other one just looks like a frame, I guess. It doesn't have
just a triangle.
It doesn't have something we would associate it with. Right. It could be a triangle if the arrow is in front of it, blocking it. Otherwise, it's just this frame. We don't, it's not something that we can associate.
Right. Good point. Last two are principle of symmetry. Symmetric elements give the human brain the feeling that everything is ordered. So yeah, our mind definitely resonates to symmetries. Simple example there. Common fate. Now you got to imagine a motion here, that elements which move in the same direction seem to be of a group. So if you're imagining all of these little, 16 circles moving according to the arrow positioning of these little purple arrows, then our mind would see all of those moving to the left as being of one group, as in the group of that which moves to the left versus the other ones moving to the right, which our minds would then identify accordingly. So again, there's these basic principles that seem simple, but have huge philosophical and even metaphysical implications as far as the ontology of being, the nature of why is mind, not what is a neurotic mind, like these guys are investigating, like what is a distorted mind, an unhealthy mind that's sick. They're starting without knowing what a healthy mind is or why it is, whereas the Gestalt psychologists are starting with why is the mind when it works, and then with that positive sense, we can then diagnose what are the distorted creative distortions that happen when we're not acting or playing the role of a healthy self. So it's a very different philosophy and a much healthier one, I would say.
There's so few psychologists that have studied normalcy. I would say, right? Like they're always looking at the abnormal, the quote unquote sick, perverse. But I would say Maslow is, and I mean, he's a whole nother conversation. I think he's got some crazy ideas too, but, but he was definitely one of the few, like he was really fascinated by what is a healthy person, what makes a flourishing person, what's a, elevated mind. He wanted to study that versus the sick person, but there weren't many.
There weren't many, but I think there's another like higher level sophistication there, knowing that Maslow has these very strange proclivities towards the Esalen Institute as well, and all this strange stuff. Like, well, where's the sleight of hand there? Because it seems healthier than the sickos that he's justly criticizing.
Right.
But then where's the sleight of hand happening? And I think that's a whole discussion that goes into. Probably we have to go into John Ruskin and his approach, or Thomas Carlyle and their approach to developing a healthy culture where people can all express their creative needs, but do it in a controlled, limited way that allow for the maintenance of an empire with pacified, satisfied little happy peasants who are all self-actualizing by expressing like little homecraft, creative painting rocks and little things that are like they're all controlled, mediocre forms of creative expression that they want to promote, so that creativity is not something solely monopolized by the elite class, but will sort of be like a pressure valve. They acknowledge the need for actualization of whole people, but they need to create a pressure valve to only allow some of that to come out and not the full thing. So I would say that Ruskin's work and Carlyle's work in that probably are closer to what Maslow was bringing back than the Gestalt healthier people, but the whole separate.
Well, and not to get too off topic, but I also think Maslow was really, I think he was one of the more genuine idealists, and idealists are not the same necessarily as esotericists, occultists who are trying to impose. But his whole Eupsychian management philosophy was a very fertile ground for the social engineers and for the elitist Malthusians to, believe that those who were part of that Eupsychian network, they could be the controllers, and that then all of humanity would, evolve theoretically. But that Eupsychian network and the whole notion of like being values is something that I think very much lent itself. But he talked about, even like with the Esalen Institute, he stumbled upon them kind of randomly. He and Bertha, his wife, were traveling. They were on a road trip, and they were stopping off somewhere where they, wanted to stay overnight. And it ended up being in Big Sur, and they were at the Esalen Institute. And the woman at the desk was actually not very nice to him at first, and then saw him sign his name, was like, "Are you Abraham Maslow? We're all reading your book. I have to introduce you to Michael Murphy."
Yeah, see, for me, I hear stories like that, and I'm like, no.
No. You're like, no, that's not how it happened. But here's the point is that
Yeah.
he did become very close to Michael Murphy, as the story goes,
Yeah.
and he says, he was like a son to him, but he was very disappointed because he said they were very interested in, as all the cults seem to be, these orgies and drug dens, and they kept talking to even Timothy Leary. I think it's in this book. I might be wrong. I'd have to look through, but I think it's in this book where they talk about the conversation where Timothy Leary was saying how, because Maslow talked about peak experiences, and Leary was saying how it's this perfect opportunity to use LSD and psychedelics for the peak experiences, and that was just one example. But Maslow was very unimpressed. He was
He's
not.
unimpressed. He's clearly speaking against this
Yeah.
misuse of his theory. Okay, that's
Yeah,
cool.
and the same thing
right.
with the Esalen Institute. They were so enamored with him, and he was very displeased. He said it was not academic, it was not intellectual. They were like, so I think it was actually Fritz Perl who was in the middle of one of his lectures and starts cozying up to a woman next to him and not paying attention to Maslow's lecture at all. And yeah, Maslow was not impressed. He said this is not what he was. Yeah,
well, that's interesting because I wanted to like him. Like I've always wanted, because I've got nothing against his hierarchy of needs. I'm like, I can't say anything bad about that. And if it's true, like if the world actually is permitted to develop infrastructure and sovereign nations that can meet the needs of their people, all of what he's saying, as far as I could see, will work out too. So anyway, I like what you're saying. So it's giving me more to. I still don't buy that original origin story of him in Esalen. It seems a little bit, but I do like the idea that there is solid evidence that he was very much disappointed and saw his ideas being misused. The way I'm saying that the Gestalt psychologists of Curler were also seeing their ideas misused and deployed for ill effects.
I'm not saying I love his ideas. I mean, he didn't publish it. Stanford Research Institute actually published it. It was actually Willis Harman who published his Politics 3, which is what he was working on before he passed. And it's really interesting. They published Politics 3 in 1970 or 1971, I think it was. And that's right before the first edition of Changing Images of Man, which was also Willis Harman. That was 1972. The final edition was 1984. But I think very interesting timing. But it was Bertha who presented this unfinished works of Maslow, and it was called Politics 3. That's what he had on all of his notes. And it's crazy. I mean, it's basically creating planetics, or what Robert Mueller would call planetics. It's this idea of using the Eupsychian network, Eupsychian values, in order to create this ruling class. These how some might interpret like the philosopher kings, only these are the spiritual kings, and they should be the ones who are going to rule, and they're going to rule the whole world. And so I'm not saying I necessarily think, but I'm not necessarily saying I think that we should adopt all of his ideas. I think elements of them, but I think that I think he was a little naive in how he was in his little bubble, and I think that they really ran with it.
I like nuanced thinking, so I'm open to this. All right, let's
go back.
Let's continue with the Gestalt Psychology slideshow, just to introduce people to. All right, so just to run through it. So Max Wertheimer, who again did a famous dialogue with Albert Einstein, they were all focused on how does the mind of a creative scientist work when it is making a discovery. So what's that period they were all looking at, and you could get that in reading Gestalt Psychology by Curler, but any of their works. They're looking at, well, what is the mind doing when it's transforming from a state of ignorance into a state of knowledge? What's that in between this moment? What is it? What is the form it takes, right? What goes before it? What comes after it? What is that in between moment during the eureka? That infinitesimal but vital substance that is so transformative for the individual, but also for the species feasibly, since every true discovery has an effect upon the species in the way that I've already alluded to. So his dialogue with Einstein is great. He writes here of his understanding of the science he is creating, saying that the basic thesis of Gestalt theory might be formulated thus: there are contexts in what is happening in the whole which cannot be deduced from the characteristics of separate pieces, but conversely, what happens to a part of the whole is, in clear-cut cases, determined by the laws of the inner structure of the whole. What does that mean? So let's just clear case studies here. A whole, the solar system as a system is a one. However, there's many parts to the one. This is obviously not to scale. Otherwise, you couldn't get all the planets in. But in just to help the mind out a little bit, all of the moons of the various planets have relationships to the planets. All of the planets have relationship to each other, but also to the sun, which itself, is part of a broader system. So you can't understand any one planet or even the climate science of any one planet unless you take the whole system as a solar system into mind first, and then with its characteristics, including the electromagnetic components, the cosmic radiation components, the magnetic field components. Unless you have all of that in the mind, you can't really understand what any of the parts are properly doing. So one example of a system of a unity. There are countless examples of these nebulae that we don't understand at all, that are breaking the laws of standard model cosmology, Big Bang cosmology, that can't provide a satisfactory, non-self-contradictory assessment of the types of physics that are active within some of these things that are being picked up. And these are just a couple of samples of some beautiful symmetries that we see in other nebulae in our just visible utilizing the Hubble telescope. This is another galaxy far removed from our own. It's the M18 or something, or maybe it's the Andromeda. I don't know, but it's a Seyfert galaxy, a spiral galaxy. Again, every one of the billion or so stars, or maybe more stars, I don't know if they can calculate how many stars are within the spiral arms, are being shaped contextually by the entire geometry, which is not that different from the sort of geometry we see when we pour some cream into our black coffee. So there are these natural hydrodynamic attributes that the mind can pick up on the small scale, on the big scale, which form as holes that shape the particles, whether it's in the milk particles in my coffee, or whether it's the stars within the galaxy. They're being shaped by intelligible holes. There's many galaxies that we've been able to pick up and identify that break the rules of what is accepted standard model atomic or cosmic physics. Again, just a few samplings of these very beautiful structures. Again,
that's what I was thinking. They're so beautiful.
It's gorgeous, eh? And I mean, this is just, again, a little sample. And when asking, well, what is causing the parts to work within the whole, those people who made real discoveries, and here's where I said earlier, there's not one, but two Western sciences that are very at war with each other. Just like I wrote the book, The Clash of the Two Americas, to get across the opposing American traditions. You could say that opposing Western philosophical scientific cultures also at war. One current is potent. It makes discoveries. It's very much rooted in the methodology espoused by Plato and made transparent by Plato in his dialogues, and applied in the form of every great scientific discovery that I have ever looked at by reading firsthand writings of people who made discoveries. They're all Platonists using the Platonic method in order to self-reflect on our own axioms all the time. So it's a constant self-examination of our heart and of our mind's assumptions, while at the same time exploring externally the objective outside universe in a pursuit of a paradox or resolving a paradox. So that's always the thing. And a great example of this, which formed, I would say, the thrust of the biggest burst of discoveries in the late 19th and early 20th century, are those who were studying the works of Johannes Kepler, who discovered his famous three planetary laws of motion, that every planet moves in not circular orbits, but rather in elliptical orbits, being his first law, discovered in 1609. His second law being the equal area, equal time principle, that it's applied to all the discoverable planets within our solar system, and it seems even in other star systems, as well as the third most beautiful musical law, which created his a proportion between it's the cube square principle or law that he discovered, that for every taking the square of the periodicity of any planet in relationship to the cube of the mean distance of said planet to the sun, because planets are always moving faster or slower, but there's a mean moment, that mean average, when you take that and you cube it, so it's a cube square relationship, you get a certain constancy that is found with it, whether you're looking at Saturn or Mars or Earth or Venus. that relationship is one of the few elements of classical physics discovered in 1619 that has continued valued application in the atomic and subatomic domain as well. So a lot of the classical physics were found to not work in the subatomic particle domain. This one does work and works very well in a variety of ways. Now, why do I have a musical scale here? Because this is what Kepler was utilizing as his base of looking for the reason why were the planets in the orbits that they were found within and not some other possible set of arrangements. And he was adopting the Platonic hypothesis as outlined in the Plato's Timaeus dialogue of the musical proportionality of the various planetary bodies, and found that indeed both the hard and soft scale, when you approach this, is verified in looking at the planets at their fastest and slowest moments at the what are called the maximum and minimum periods of their orbits, that which is closest to the sun's and the sun that which is closest. And you could take those relationships of maximum minimum and then find that you have, like in the case of Earth there, a mi-fa relationship, where in Venus, which is closer to a circle, doesn't have a lot of variability, whereas Mercury it's more than an octave of variability because it's a very, very expanded ellipse, meaning that the eccentricities, the two foci, are very separated, whereas in a circle, the two eccentricities come together as a unity and you get a circle. The more you separate the foci from a center, you get a more expanded ellipse, right, with more extreme differentials of slow and fast. So that the whole thing, as he points out in his Harmonies of the World, which is a book that people can read. It's literally something. It's a bit expensive, but it's worth it if people can find it and buy it. The Harmonies of the World is great, and he goes through exactly what his mind is doing when he's discovering these principles of planetary motion. So extremely important stuff that impacts the field of Gestalt psychology. And as we pointed out as well, this also applies to the question of if somebody asks, well, why are the chlorophyll molecules in the oak tree leaf, how are they different from the elm tree leaf? They're both chlorophyll molecules. They're both atoms. There's carbon in both, but yet there's a qualitative difference in species that is discoverable. So you got one thing, chlorophyll, or the tree, that has a relationship with the sun, living matter relationship on the earth, right? It's a driving force of the ecosystems. Without that, you don't get ecosystems. So very important, but the mind can differentiate different species that have different functions within a system of the biosphere that they happen to be located within. Everything has a purpose within a system. So this is sort of like the healthy approach, I would say, to systems analysis that's been so abused by the cyberneticists who want to like a machine. Curler, who I adore. He's, like I said, I've read so much of his stuff, especially his Place of Value in a World of Facts is a wonderful book, where he makes, I got a couple of quotes here. One of which he says, apart from physical chemistry and electrochemistry, the most important discipline, which will have to be included in the list, is potential theory, the theory of macroscopic self-distributions. Unfortunately, this field shares the neglect in which many parts of classical physics have fallen since atomic physics came into the foreground. Now, that's one statement where he's making the point that potential theory is going to be very valuable for the development of Gestalt psychology as far as macroscopic self-distributions, which is basically what I went through with the galaxy formation. Like, you've got organized self-organizing systems in nature, which are organized according to some form of field or another. Now, he's referring here to the problem of a lack of appreciation of this mode of analysis because of something new that had just been happening in the realm of atomic physics. What is he referring to? He's not saying atomic physics is bad. What he's saying is it got perverted. And he's directly referring to the 1927 Solvay Conference. And this was a battle royale between two different schools of science clashing. And it's literally down the middle here, where between like Einstein, Madame Curie, Max Planck, there in the foreground. These were people who were artists, scientists, all of them. Madame Curie was a painter, artist of a fantastic and developed nature. Einstein was a classical violinist. Max Planck was a concert pianist. all of these people were producing sonatas and sonatas together. They were performing Mozart and Beethoven together when they were trying to work through mathematical problems that they couldn't solve logically. That relationship to their musical craft was a big part of the creative process as a whole, which you did not get with the Copenhagen crowd. Max Heisenberger up here on the upper right-hand side. You got Niels Bohr is there on the right. The whole Copenhagen crowd is up there on the right-hand side. These are basically the statistical probability theorists who were purely mathematical rejectors of truthfulness. So all of them, including especially Niels Bohr, the founder of the Copenhagen school that created the standard model of the atom that we know of today, or that's encouraged that we use today, he ontologically rejects the existence of truthfulness. That's a philosophical requirement to come into his school, is that you must reject the belief that there is any ontological claim to truth, because the logic to justify that, what he says is, as soon as you try to look at an atom, you change it. And so because you can't, you can seem to
this idea. So it's like mentalism, essentially. You look at it and then it's already changed because you're impacting it. This they try to prove this with like the protons, right? That's where like one mirrors the other. And I know CERN was working on this too, which I recently went to CERN. It looks like a demonic temple, but I like literally, and they're telling you they're going to rewrite the story of the universe, and very little of it is based on any science. I'm sure there's some, but that's very interesting. Okay, I was like, I don't understand how. But there's this idea that you're projecting onto it, and therefore it gets changed as soon as you.
Well, yeah, it's a legitimate observation that happens. Like as soon as you try to use an electron microscope to see the position and speed of an electron in motion, the very act of looking at it requires that some photons strike the electron to then bounce back up into the apparatus you're utilizing as an observer, to then go get received into your eye, to get registered into some electromagnetic information that's then sent to your brain, that's processed and acknowledged and identified in it with a time lag as, you know, the electron's position or whatever. But that slight act of striking the electron in motion is moving the electron. So you're thus disrupting the objective state, where then people say, oh, you can only know the position or the velocity of an atom, of an electron, or of a photon, but you cannot know both. And as soon as you try, you break the objectivity, and thus because you break the visual objectivity, thus there is no truth. It's like that lame. But that's the sort of like foundation as well that the Frankfurt School later on used when they crafted their theories of pure relativism, that there's no truth, because as soon as a human being tries to influence anything in their environment, they change their environment, so that you cannot say that that there is such a thing as an environment or an individual, and they start getting really, or every feeling we have is a true feeling, and because all we have are feelings, thus we have infinite truths, and thus there is no truth. All of this stuff kind of is justifying itself in a tautology with this fraud of an interpretation of the atom, of which there were other interpretations that people like, I would say Louis de Broglie, who's there, the guy with the Hitler mustache, unfortunate choice of mustache, but he's a really great who's looking at things like the wave, the leader wave, or the leader particle that's shaping a wave. He had a whole different wave particle integration that was tied to an idea of whole processes with purpose that was much more potent than what the Frankfurt School random probability theorists were promoting. So, and also definitely people like Max Planck, Einstein, Madame Curie were at war with them, and they were the ones who we are told by the official historiographers of science, we're told that Einstein and the people making the discoveries, Max Planck, and they were the old guard. They were too unwilling to let go of their belief in truth and classical, physics, that they couldn't see the new innovators, the new kids on the block. And so they're rusty, crusty old things. And they were ousted from like anything like the secret science programs being created under the Manhattan Project. Einstein was ousted from that. Kurt Gödel was ousted from that because they didn't fit the priesthood's demands of what scientists should reject: truth, morality, when they're going to be granted the rights to interact with real science. So that was precondition of becoming a scientist, is the rejection of moral reality. So yeah, those and the directly there. And a lot of this is, again, very occulty.
Yeah.
Niels Bohr tied very much to a weird perversion of Taoist occultism that he was also enmeshing his soul with. It gets weird, but keeping it simple, and that's the simple sort of in a modern textbook, how they still promote how to interpret the Copenhagen standard model in science today, which involves the presumption of these specific orbital shells. It's like there's it participates in a degree of truthfulness, of course, but there's a lot of false assumptions, like the assumption that most of the atom, we are told, is empty space. Like we're told that 99% of is both random, that you cannot know where the electrons are going to be. You cannot know where the protons inside of the supposed nucleus of the atom are going to be located. It's all kind of random, stochastic, and at the same time separated by empty space. So we're mostly made up of random emptiness. So this is where the wise person who's really been through a Frankfurt School style education will be trained to believe that snow is black, right? Or that order is chaos, that the opposite is true, right? It seems like there's beauty of a flower, but in reality, I know it's just empty space and random, right? Though, and I'm wise. It's the stupid people, right? The lowly stupid people who believe in beauty. And just to be clear, when I said that there is another more potent school of atomic physics, going back to the geometry of the structure of a galaxy, what's been found by people like Anthony Perrott of the 1970s doing work on plasma hydrodynamics. And I mean, plasma physics is like a really important domain of science where a lot of potent discoveries were being made. And that's, I think, why a lot of it has been attacked over the past 50 years in the sabotage of fusion development, which requires a study of plasma fluids, the fourth state of matter, how there's certain least action pathways, just like planetary orbits, inside of the flow of currents that can create things like the Z-pinch, things that involve putting in a very low level amount of energy to get a very big outcome of effect as far as cold fusion is concerned. And what was found is that on the very subatomic domain in picoseconds, what was discovered by Anthony Perrott and a few others was that there were a flow of within plasmas, both solitons would form, like little spheres akin to almost like stars, suns. So they call them solitons, would form for small periods of self-organization. Small vortices would form. And you'd also get these interesting anomalies where these solitons would begin to also have in proximity like almost like a dual star effect of rotation with each other, all happening very, very quickly, quicker than the eye can perceive. And taking on the character of what we can identify as the structure also of galaxies that seem to be a more expanded form of physical spacetime, but a very similar process is seemingly occurring. And we find in the Hubble telescope's data, all of these images within the microscopic plasma occurring in shaping the geometry of quasars, nebula, nova, different galaxies. So very interesting that there's this parallelism on the macro and the micro. Right. And just quickly, this is like one example of the tendency towards toral geometries within plasmas that are contained within, in this case, it's a tokamak design of a reactor, but there's other types of designs. But the idea of a toroidal force is something we see within the Van Allen belts, within planetary phenomenon, but we also see it obviously bear a lot of fruit when investigating plasmas. That's an example of it, and of it actually being observed by the Ulysses spacecraft. Here's another example of some of the geometries that are occurring within plasmas too, that are like both toroidal, but also this other weird shape that just naturally forms by nature. It's not like good or bad. It's not a cult. It's just like that's showing us the structure of physical reality, which then I think occultists will tend to latch onto and then create weird rituals around some of these phenomenon for the inner elite alone to somehow have magical influence over the ignorant masses. Yes. So now I was going to wind it down with a few quotes here. Wolfgang Köhler made the point, and this is where it gets really interesting, that his teacher was Max Planck.
Okay.
And he says, when reading the formulae of the physicist, one may emphasize this or that aspect of their content. The particular aspect of the formula in which the Gestalt psychologists became interested had for decades been given little attention. No mistake had ever been made in applications of the formulae, because what now fascinated us had all the time been present in their mathematical form. So he's attacking the fetishists, the mathematical fetishists who are trying to mathematize everything, but they can't see quantities. Hence, all calculations in physics had to come out right. But it does make a difference whether you make explicit what a formula implies or merely use it as a reliable tool. So if you're using your formula to generate a concept of what reality is, you're screwed. If you use it as a tool in the pursuit of an understanding of a reality, you're in a better place, is what he's trying to say. You got to use it well. You can't make physics follow in the dance with math. Math has to always follow in the dance of physics. And that's been part of the sleight of hand that's been used by the cyberneticists to get us all into this weird game theory model where we're looking at reality as if it's just knowable by mathematical probability theory representation, and it's not. But does it make a difference? But it does make a difference, right? Sorry. We had, therefore, good reasons for being surprised by what we found, and we naturally felt elated when the new reading of the formula told us that organization is as obvious in some parts of physics as it is in psychology. So again, that there's a composition in the organizational structures, self-organizing structures within reality. We've gone through a ton of examples, but also thus within the mind that explores the reality. There are certain field attributes of the brain, what he called psychophysical parallelisms. So the mind will create a measurable set of parallels to the physics being explored by the mind. So you know, if the mind works well, you'll find certain electrochemical aspects and geometries in the brain with a healthy mind that you wouldn't see in a distorted mind that's miswired or working poorly. So there is something physically valid, but don't assume that the mind is what you're looking at. The mind, this is a shadow of a higher function of the mind, because that the mind is tied to purpose. And then he says, what I love here, incidentally, others were no less interested in this new reading than we were. These other people were eminent physicists. Max Planck once told me that he expected our approach to clarify a difficult issue which had just arisen in quantum physics, if not that concept of the quantum itself. I love that. And he made the point, as he was a student of Planck, Planck was teaching composition, which is something that they were teaching in classical humanist education in Germany before it got really sabotaged. But composition, both in music but in everything, is very important. Poetry. And that something has to have a beginning, middle, and end, but also develop, have a punchline, set things up for a purpose in the future. And that the quantum, Max Planck believed, could be resolved by this new field of science of mind being developed that could then resolve it. Why does he say that? Okay, well, a couple of important quotes from Max Planck, 1935, were in his Philosophy of Physics, which is a gorgeous essay. In dealing with the structure, Max Planck says, in dealing with the structure of any science, a reciprocal interconnection between epistemological judgments, that's the science of knowledge, and judgments of value was found to arise, that no science can be wholly disentangled from the personality of the scientists. So again, he's not being a relativist, but he's saying we have to acknowledge the objective reality of the personality, but the personality is shaped by whether or not you are somebody who has discovered a value in self-examining your mind, or is your personality shaped by somebody who is ignorant of this important quality of being human? Because if you're ignorant of that, then you're an ideologue acting like a scientist, and all of your behavior will be sort of pre-programmed, predestined based on that ignorant impulse you have to believe without knowing and to fit things into a model without understanding it. So you will be a different thing. You will always have the potential of discovering your folly and making a corrective. However, you will not behave the way somebody who has learned how to do that will behave in similar problem-solving situations. And the personality, how you feel, the type of higher emotions that you may or may not have access to, agapic love or not, will also be shaped by that ignorance or knowledge of how the mind is and why it is. So very clear for Max Planck, the musician. And further on in that same essay, he says, we may perhaps deal with free will. Looked at subjectively, the will, insofar as it looks to the future, is not causally determined, because any cognition of the subject's will itself acts causally upon the will, so that any definitive cognition of a fixed causal nexus is out of question. In other words, we might say that looked at from outside objectively, the will is causally determined, and that looked at from the inside subjectively, it is free. So he's not saying either or, because if you actually are a mature person, you discover that what you desire should actually be, not should be, but you want to do what duty compels you to do. You're not at war with yourself. So
Right.
the idea of like, you know, we're born, we have responsibilities. Every freedom we have comes with a responsibility to defend, protect, and improve upon it. That responsibility imposes constraints on the will. Well, should that thus mean that we're always going to be at war? Or can we learn why it is more joyful to do our duty and defend our freedoms than it is to just be, you know, hedonistic animals,
Right.
you know, just going from moment to moment for cake, one kick after the other. So he's really just getting at the dichotomies are, it's a false dichotomy that we've been put into for a very long time. And yes, the last one. And Albert Einstein, who again was close friends with Max Wertheimer, his Gestalt studies on Einstein's creative process are really a must read. And Albert Einstein writes, and Planck has similar things that he's written on this too, but he writes that the theory of relativity occurred to me by intuition, and music is the driving force behind this intuition. My parents had me study the violin from the time I was 6. My new discovery is the result of musical perceptions. And then he says, I believe that events in nature are controlled by a much stricter and closely binding law than we suspect today, when we speak of one event being the cause of another. Our concept here is confined to one happening within one time section. It is dissected from the whole process. Our present rough way of applying the causal principle is quite superficial. We are like a child who judges a poem by its rhyme and not its rhythm. Or we are like a juvenile learner at the piano, just relating one note to that which immediately precedes or follows. To an extent, this may be very well when one is dealing with a simple composition, but it will not do for the interpretation of a Bach fugue. Quantum physics has presented us with very complex processes, and to meet them, we must further enlarge and refine our concept of causality itself. So it's the idea of causality that they're saying has to be reevaluated, because if you think from the standpoint of the future, well, it's like the very, what is it now, hour and 30 minutes that we've been chatting, and I've been going through this little composition I prepared. The whole thing, it wasn't like every moment is just random. Everything was being shaped by my desire to get at this slide right here. Now the thing is done, but that future state, and I'm hoping that the discoveries, or at least the awakening in the audience watching this program, I'm hoping that intention I have to shape the things that I did in the way that I did it was a future organizing the unfolding of each moment that was happening along the way. So if one were to have asked, like, well, what is causing you to go from this slide to that one? If they were, let's say, a mechanical probability theorist, they would have said, well, it's because you clicked on your brain sent a signal to your hand to click on the mouse, and thus it got that effect. And what caused that? Well, they'll always have like another material electromagnetic excretion that they can always say caused the next thing. But the reality was there was a higher intentionality behind the whole thing. And that's like that for everything, even simple things. When people wake up in the morning and they go to like make themselves a sandwich before they go to work, it's that future sandwich that's already made as an idea, which is governing the unfolding of each one of your actions on the small scale. And the more you get used to that, people get used to thinking of how the future, their future intention and ideas of it impact how they choose to navigate through the reality that they're living in at every sequence. They can expand it and extend that to like, what's the future self I want to be if I want to quit smoking, or if I want to actually get healthy, you know, if I want to be able to run the marathon, or if I want that. And you could extend that, and you could extend it to the even beyond the limits of your life, you know. And people who are really, really solid, they've exercised that thinking about, well, what is my kid's life? What is my grandkid's life going to be looking back at me? How are they going to review or judge what I did or didn't do in the course of the challenge that I had when they were looking, you know, when I was living? And so it's part of just that idea. And the oligarchy is quite good at extending their gestalt into the future. They're very, very well practiced at it.
Yes,
They're very good
the
at it.
futurists. Yeah, future architects. Yeah.
But they lack a certain other thing that the Gestalt psychologists were bringing online. So that was my introduction to Gestalt psychology, which I hope will help people watching differentiate how it's been misused to control them.
Yeah. So how do you think that Lewin subverted it? How does that come into play?
Well, I think through his approach to field dynamics. So he was trying to also take the science of field theory and apply it in the form that he did, as far as like, because he was in charge of setting up what was called the Research Center for Group Dynamics.
Yeah.
And how each group is
At
shaped
MIT.
by higher at MIT. Yeah, exactly. And so he was looking at how do you nudge the group? He was and he also was imposing his own ironically behaviorist presumptions of the nature of mechanical humans onto the group that had to be influenced, and how people make certain. He was observing that people make certain decisions when they're in a state of tension, when they're in a state of uncertainty, that will result in desirable outcomes that would otherwise not be made if they weren't in a state of tension. So he was taking some of the material by Eric Trist, or even of Rawlings Rees, who actually can we do the presentation of the screen again of my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, there's just one last thing here.
Yeah.
Right, because Kurt Lewin also he incorporated game theory and cybernetics. He was working with Norbert Wiener and the Josiah Macy Foundation to a certain point to help promote cybernetics after World War II. He ended up dying in 1949, but he did a lot of work also with what's his name, Paul Lazarsfeld, who also was a Rockefeller agent working at the Princeton Radio Research Institute for the H.G. Wells War of the Worlds broadcast. Yeah, just to see how group dynamics would react, sociologically speaking, to the idea of an invasion from outer space. Yeah, exactly. And he was part of the
And Cantrell was roommates with Rockefeller at Dartmouth.
No, it's a small network. Okay? It's a small club. Yeah, and they were also friends with George Gallup as well. And so they were early on realizing the value of like how Gallup polls could influence mass opinion by just telling people.
Bernays called it public opinion making.
Yeah, exactly. And you just tell people what everybody else is thinking. That don't you want to also 86% of Canadians believe that we should be arrested for walking outside with no mask. Like that was something given to us, even though there was no evidence that was ever true. And then it did have an effect on the weaker segment of the population who was like, yeah, people should be arrested for walking around with no mask. It's like, that's not your opinion. So yeah, just to go back to the picture of Lewin there quickly. And then Maxwellian. So he took the Vienna School's radical positivist interpretation of field theory through James Maxwell, who again was part of this British school that rejected metaphysics, and he imposed that instead of the Max Planck school of the Keplerians, the Platonists, who had a very different idea of what that meant. And that was then applied in the form and also the standard model. So the idea was, okay, everything is organized in systems that are entropic, that are closed, but that at the same time, every element within it is random. So every person is ultimately, he said, and these people believe, irrational behaviors within an otherwise controlled, closed system. And this is what also people like the Mont Pelerin Society leaders, like George Soros's guru, what's his name? Popper was saying with his theory of reflexivity as well. Yeah, who created the open societies as well. They don't, and so they at least recognize that you have to satisfy the fact that each of these irrational elements, particles in the gas theory, because it's like an irrationalist gas theory, believe that they have free will, but they don't. And so because they believe that they do, and they desire irrational things like freedom, you have to satisfy that somehow with little pressure valves, giving them the illusion of the thing, but none of the reality of it. So the idea of like local group dynamics, local control was a big part of what they were promoting as well, to break up nation states, break up institutions that could otherwise, or unions that could otherwise normally collectively move together, for the benefit of the people being abused by the Rockefellers or whatever. And the last thing I got here is the guy who was the first director of the World Federation for Mental Health and the leader of Tavistock famously stated,
who said we should be fifth columnists, but yeah. And he wrote Shaping Psychiatry by War.
Yeah, that book was like the gospel manual for all of these creatures who wanted to look at and who created MK Ultra and all these things to how do you take trauma, shock therapy to help facilitate nudging people, either schisming them in some cases when you want to like fragment a personality as an individual target, or a whole group, whether in a school or whether in a society, and have them become deconstructed to be reconstructed. They were looking at all the shell shock victims of World War I. And one of the things he says of his change agents, that if we propose to come out into the open and to attack the social and national problems of our day, then we must have shock troops. And these cannot be provided by psychiatry based wholly on institutions. We must have teams of well-selected, well-trained psychiatrists who are free to move around and make contacts with local situations in their particular area. That's my last slide. And it reminded me a little bit of what you were describing of like Kurt Lewin's role just always being assigned easily to be in an influential position in Stanford and MIT, at the UN, anywhere. He was just always being positioned around as an initiated shock troop. And there's a whole network of these things that just grew and grew over the Cold War, and were infiltrated into the military industrial complex. They created the INSNA. They created the whole social what do you call it? Like Twitter, Facebook, it's based on social networking. In the 70s. They were looking at like, there were people like Margaret Mead, who also was a friend of Kurt Lewin at a certain point.
Yeah. And Bateson was involved with Timothy Leary and Estlin, and
he was in control of a whole MK Ultra department. And they were working with British imperial anthropologists, being, at the Livingston Institute, that would go down into Africa and just screw around with like local tribes. And, they were working with people like Frank Kitson, who was also giving feedback to Tavistock by creating his different counterinsurgency operations in the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya. And, they were looking at how do these groups within African tribes work together, associate together, and they created these Gestalt-like networks of systems that they could then manipulate to induce these different tribes to fight each other at different times, or subvert revolutionary movements for independence. They did it also that, this guy was brought in, Frank Kitson was then brought into Ireland to play a role in the 70s with Operation Gladio, to take his lessons from Africa and to then, deploy provocateurs to create letter bombs and other terrorist actions that would then justify more clampdown against the Irish Republican movements, and blame it on the IRA, or infiltrate the IRA sometimes with your own agents. Then they did that to inform the INSNA that was then created by Lazarsfeld, which was utilizing Kurt Lewin's works on group dynamics and a lot of these imperialists to then create social networks that became at the heart of the growth of first it was MySpace, but Facebook and Twitter, and the whole thing is to give people the illusion that your freedom is in your network, that you'll tend to only associate people who already think like you, and you'll have the illusion of having free opinion, but you're only being listened to by people who tend to already think like you and associate as such. Or you'll just occasionally cross paths with somebody from another network who has a different set of axioms, who will like spit on you, and you'll fight for a little bit, and then you'll run back into your hive or your tribe. So it's this creation of tribalism, to give people a sense of, okay, local control. You'll have an illusion of freedom, of little micro freedoms, but you won't actually have the real thing. And that's how they subverted, I think, the nation state of America itself. And then they spread it out more broadly. But yeah, Kurt Lewin bad.
Oh, Kurt Lewin definitely bad. Yeah, he talked about creating. He literally said, because he was studying, the group dynamics, and he was talking about how people could, under peer pressure, succumb and give up their most convicted beliefs, and that's something we should do. And he created the T groups, which is the sensitivity training, goes by all these different names. And the CIA, there's a document in 1974. I actually read it in my episode, but they talk about how it is brainwashing. And there's one of their first manuals, I believe it was a National Training Lab manual, page 47. They actually say it is brainwashing. But the CIA talked about how they really wanted to study the efficacy of this sensitivity training to see if it would be great to utilize for conflict resolution. But they culminate by saying, well, we really can't do this because it's too reminiscent of the brainwashing tactics used in China, and we don't want to harm our military. They didn't say exactly, but I think like the Maoist techniques in the struggle sessions, because that's essentially what it is. And this is, what grew into, because the whole premise behind all of this was organizational psychology, right? So let's see if I have here like operational research, and they were operational research and social sciences. A Tavistock, it's edited by J.R. Lawrence, but this is a Tavistock published book, and this was so they could bring it into the corporate culture, and that they would use sensitivity training. But this also spun off with Est and Esalen, and then Landmark Forum, I think, was the most kind of colloquial, and they called T groups sensitivity training for normals, which I think would be like normies, right? To make it kind of accessible to the masses. And I actually did 2 different groups. They're offshoots of Landmark. Landmark is the one people tend to know because they have a website, and it's much more I guess formulaic and more academic in the sense that they have very specific classes. But there are so many offshoots of them, and this they would do these things where, I mean, it's really traumatic. It's all this trauma bonding. They have you do role playing. This is what sensitivity training is. This is all Kurt Lewin's work. And I remember it. It's like they have you play these games, and there's like the win-win. And so they basically get everybody to come on the ship, and you can't have any kind of independent thought or any dissension, because it has to be win-win, which basically means conform. And the other thing that I remember in these groups is that everybody would hold hands, and these 2 different groups, completely separate companies. Every time you walk into the room, every time you leave the room, they would hold hands, and they would play the song Imagine, which, is like basically like communist brainwashing, and everybody would hold hands and cry together while they play this song. And this is how you enter the room, and this is how you leave the room.
So dirty. It's so dirty.
And if you look at the Tavistock website now, they talk about the Leicester Conference, right, which has been going on since, I believe, 1957, and I think they're doing their next one in September. And I actually consider going for research purposes, but I realized it's literally going to be 2 weeks, and I'm sure it's not cheap. I don't know how much it is, but it's literally 2 weeks of sensitivity training. And they talk about how, like, they're creating change agents, and they're going to be doing these workshops, which are, I mean, they're essentially brainwashing group, but you're going to do that for 2 weeks. And I was like, I don't think I'm up for that, but it's right on the website. They talk about change agents, they talk about praxis, and they talk about the Gnostic reticulus. Now is your time. This is an awakening organization. We are recruiting you now. Yeah, but this is the Leicester Conference, so
stay away from that thing. I think you know it. No, it's I had a friend of mine who was a competitor in ultimate frisbee, and he was going through the destruction of ultimate frisbee as an example, where through these different sensitivity training seminars that for some reason were infused into those who were managing, I guess, the more professional teams. They were nudging the whole thing towards
everywhere.
Avoiding winners or losers and just playing for the sake of playing. And at a certain point, he was like, "Look, I'm just passing the frisbee around. There's no like point of winning because I'm going to hurt somebody's feelings, and anything I like. There's a whole bunch of like limits that were just imposed based upon people's feeling state, but it totally defeated the purpose of why is there competitive sports?" And Gnostic reticulation.
Yeah, sorry, keep that there. I didn't want to cut him off, but I do want you to see this Gnostic reticularity and the politics of revelation.
Oh God.
So I guess they're taking the premise of like a reticularity in biology to create like these structures for Gnosticism, and I mean it's right there. I mean they say it. I always feel like when I try to piece things together, and I'll give you my interpretation, and people think I'm just talking crazy talk, but I'm like, look, it's right. It's on there. They say it. It's not like me making stuff up. This is right on their website.
Yeah. They're literally, they have prayers for like Lucifer channeling. It's like, it's anyway. But I think
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off with you.
Fred Wills, the foreign minister of Guyana, who got like 5 assassination attempts before he said, okay, this is too much. Back in the late 70s, he characterized this whole Tavistockian infiltration into the UN, saying that this is the world's longest continually run brainwashing program for developing sector leaders. And he was saying that in 1978. But so you got this thing that, because people wonder, where do these technocrats come from? You listen to the speeches of the majority of the people who work at the European Union or the European Parliament or Brussels or, God forbid, Washington D.C. Just look at the cultish glazed over eyeballs and the complete disassociation from reality or any understanding of what the people want, to the point that they're even calling any leader that tends to actually do what the people kind of already want, which the point of democracy, they call them like populists. We know better than the populists. It's like, you're populist because you're doing what the popular opinion wants you to do and not trying to kill the people. So it's that they're all conditioned by this whole culture that they have to sort of get into. And you get that in high schools, even with these model UNs, training people about how do you come to decisions in politics. Which is not the way any of these decisions actually happen. And they always have a facilitator, some change agent, whether the teacher, who's usually positioned there to like shape the conversation of the classroom, trying to solve a problem, into the pre-designed conclusion that they want the kids to come to on any topic. And the kids have the feeling, if it's done well, that they came to it themselves. And
it's crazy. Yeah. And that's really, it's all coming out of this. That's so interesting, because when you think about the Gestalt, the original Gestalt psychologist, I mean, that is actually a very fascinating study, just of how do we perceive things. And humans are meaning making creatures. That is what we do. And I think that, I always say that the parasite class, that's just seems to be the best name for them, but they capitalize on that because that's the way they can steer people. And so they're always talking about how we have to rewrite the story. It's like everything I go through, that I keep seeing that over and over again. It's rewrite the story, but what are they rewriting the story into? And it always seems to be to steer towards the same goal, which is ultimately this one world. Now it looks like it's the AI world society, but in every context, that's rewriting the story, right? Because it's Klaus Schwab has his the great narrative. We have like Leotard, he had his meta narratives. We have Arc talks about we need a better story, we need a new story. And then the cosmoerotic humanists, they say we need to rewrite the story of the universe. And then when I went to CERN, they said the same thing. Yeah, they do. Rewrite the story of the universe. And when I went to CERN, they said the same thing. You talked about, they acknowledge, and it's always kind of giving a sense, they use a little bit of science to lend credibility. And they talked about how they recognize that, people don't accept the narrative of the Big Bang. At CERN, they double down on it. They said, well, there's not just one Big Bang, there's 4 Big Bangs.
Yeah.
Yes, there's 4 Big Bangs, and we have to rewrite the story of the universe so we understand our place in it.
Oh God, it's so like it's just make believe gone awry, eh? Well, the C.S. Lewis did a great job in his Hideous Strength. Have you ever read The Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis?
Not.
Oh, it's so good. It's part of his space trilogy.
Okay.
And the third one, my wife Cynthia, my wife, did a whole series of lectures on these 3 books. One lecture for each book.
Okay.
And in the final one, The Hideous Strength, he's directly taking aim at the Tavistockians, of the transhumanists who are trying to recreate the universe in their own perverse image, which is a real perversion of science. And C.S. Lewis has got his finger on the pulse nicely. Really underrated book.
Okay. This is The Hideous Strength. I'm very behind on all C.S. Lewis.
Each one is sort of a standalone. One is like The Escape from the Silent Planet, the first one. The second one is Paralandra, and then the third one is, yeah, there it is. That hideous strength. So good. Such a good read.
Okay. Well, I'll put that on my list for sure.
But it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, but it is the Gnostic thing, right? Like at the end of the day, that's the idea of if we are all gods,
Yes.
then it's our job to not just participate in God's creation, which I would say is a very healthy thing to want to do, to recognize that you're made in the image of God, that you have a divine spark, and that gives you the ability to both understand the purpose of creation, with thus the associated power of participating in the orientation of what creation already wants. We can green deserts in decades, whereas if you left it to nature, it might take thousands of years. If you have like a well-organized society that desalinates water, that plans for the future in a, like Lincoln said, right? If you want to predict the future, the best way is to create it. And
Right.
that's like solid, you know, if you care about
Yeah.
people and that love of people is animating you, and you got a social value that's true, then yeah, you're participating in the unfolding. You could imagine within a century of proper organization and discovery that we could start, green terraforming Mars, frankly. Like that's not unfathomable
Mm-hmm.
if you do things well and you don't tolerate oligarchical empires to sabotage discoveries, and our tendency to yearn to leap outside of the known and into the unknown with the faith that we have
Mm-hmm.
it within us to learn how to fly. You know, when you jump off the branch, it's a little scary. You go out into space, it's scary. There's things you don't know, and you have to have faith that our wings are our mind's ability to discover with no end. It's the resource that keeps giving if you
Mm-hmm.
treat it as such. And so the Gnostics kind of turn that whole thing inside out, and they're like, no, we are the gods. Nothing is going to be right until we somehow recreate the universe and make everything GMO, and every single plant that exists has to be made in a lab. And it's a
Well,
total version of like the reality of the thing.
the worst part of it now, though, and this goes all the way back, I would argue to, even before the Neoplatonists, but it's this idea now. They say that it's just the language is so dumbed down now that the way they say it is just so blatant. But they say that, we are the human beings are going to be the savior for God. And they say that, right, that our co-creation is that we're going to save him. But it goes back to this idea of God can't know himself,
Yeah.
right? And so we save him by helping him to know himself, which is actually kind of just, it's so ludicrous, regardless of what worldview you subscribe to,
Yeah.
whether you have a biblical framework or not. The idea that if God is God, then why would he need humans to help
Yeah.
him know himself and save him from himself?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, this is for anybody who wants to dive into this, and I think in a really useful way,
Yeah.
the Leibniz versus Clarke debate. There's a
Okay.
series of letters at the end of Leibniz's life where Clarke represents, he's a handler of Isaac Newton, representing the Newtonian school of cosmology. And Leibniz's position is he's a Keplerian. He's a follower
Mhm.
of Johannes Kepler, and he's a Platonist. He's writing in Platonic dialogues. He's discovering things, whereas the other ones are describing things. He's discovering the infinitesimal calculus and so much more. And his position, he's like saying that, look, you're saying you believe in a moral God. You're using the words, the Newtonians, except that the mechanical universe that you presume exists in the system of the Principia Mathematica, which later on Bertrand Russell tries to revive in 1913 to try to subvert the actual discoveries that were being made by Max Planck and Einstein and others. That's why Bertrand Russell called his thing the Principia Mathematica, to revive Newton. But what Newton is doing is he's presuming a clockwork universe of a machine that has a limited amount of force, that as things move is causing a distribution of the limited force, resulting in a clock winding down and periodically being so badly created or designed that the creator of said clock has to intervene to rewind up the clock yet again, which gets at I think the idea of the imposition of the multiple big bangs before our reality idea. That, and Leibniz is saying, no, that's absurd. Why would the creator make the universe so irresponsibly that it would like screw itself over to the point that the creator would have to restart the creation periodically? And the Newtonians were perfectly happy with that, which was at the basis of that concept. Was at the basis of the creation out of the British Royal Society, again under Rudolf Clausius in the 1860s, of the concept of of entropy, or the second law of thermodynamics, which just took that clockwork idea and just sort of introduced a little bit of like considerations of heat thermodynamics to it.
Mm-hmm.
And observe that, okay, well, whenever we have a machine, there's a limited amount, there's many parts that move together for the purpose of a whole machine to do its thing, which is a fine thing to observe. And, you know, the people who are actually discovering the principles of heat mechanics, like Gaspar Monge or Lazare Carnot or Sadi Carnot was the big one. In the 1830s, they were doing it they weren't trying to say you could learn how the whole universe works by looking at a machine. They were just simply saying that a machine does this. You can't make a perpetual motion machine because it'll always require that more heat be used up to make the parts move to get an effect than is being created. And so that could feed back into the thing when it's man-made. And that's part of just technology, the science of technology itself. Whereas he's not saying the universe does that. Whereas the entropy school in the Royal Society, they were saying, no, that's what the whole universe is doing, that, you know, everything as it moves away, that every new baby that's born is using up energy. That's always a limited amount of energy that was created at some moment, which they said in the 1930s was like the Big Bang. And that thus every baby is causing the acceleration of the heat death of the universe on some limited scale. There's less energy to go around to maintain the universe with every new child. So thus it would be better if there were fewer of us, or maybe none of us, to make the universe last a little bit longer before it dies. Because everybody burns heat. You know, my body's using heat energy. That's the philosophical. So
but it's also creating. It's so backwards.
Yeah, their idea is that destruction causes that all of the things we see as creation are being shaped teleologically by a future destruction, a future annihilation. So annihilation causes creation. Whereas the opposing school would say that no, annihilation is a secondary aspect to creation, but it's not necessary that annihilation happen for creation to happen. It's not necessary that evil happen in order for the good to exist. That's a healthier school, which is supported by the Gnostics, who are like, no, you need the force of evil in order to give the good any meaning. Otherwise, good doesn't matter.
The primeval evil, right?
The primeval evil,
yeah.
The Manichaean sort of force that we have to kind of honor because it's needed. That God needed evil. God needs evil in order to have goodness. So we have to honor evil as a force that even God respects. So he gets this weird cause. You know, things can get Crowley fast. You know?
Yeah. they do. It always seems to kind of devolve in that direction. I feel like every single thread I pull in all the research, that's where it ends up.
And then you're sacrificing children in CERN or whatever. You know, like what? How did that go from like try to help God be a creator of the universe? How do you get from that to, well, got to kill more human sacrifices? What? It doesn't seem to make sense at first until you're like, okay, there's more there's more coloring to this than I realized.
They have a worldview. They're trying to correlate, and they're trying
the
to.
Gnostics were the Gnostics tended to frown, even in the 2nd and 3rd century. They tended to frown upon the idea of having families, of producing babies. That was not something that they generally encouraged, which is why they were a bit disruptive, even to the Romans, who were like, they weren't always so happy.
Even the original Gnostics, like the
original Gnostics were not typically promoting social value. Like they were resisting they were of the view that in order for each of us to be God, we had to be liberated from the social values and customs that were imposing onto our will to do what we want to do as far as license goes. And so the idea of the expectation to have a family, to have certain ethics, this is all prohibitive to our free will's desire to be itself and to give into our lusts. So there was like, a process of conditioning within the mystery schools of the early Marcion, especially the followers of Simon Magus. That definitely got you to actually cannibalization at a certain point where you had to, they were doing the sacrament by actually cannibalizing babies. They were doing human sacrifices and very sacred orgies were part of it, which were not conducive to maintaining families if you got to that place, you know. of
Right.
turning out the candle, as they called it. And yeah, the whole Gnostic school, all of the different sub schools, kind of like they multiplied the way the Theosophists and the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and all of these groups tend to like just multiply and subdivide. You know, that's what they were doing. Because at each point, when you get somebody who's a high initiate who becomes a self-actualized God person, then they
Uh-huh.
have the authority of God. They'll create their own school with their own slight different flavor.
Slight difference, and then they can pretend that they're competing against each other, but they're basically just like a slight variation of the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and they might, on some level, be competing with a rival group, maybe, because there is a lot of ego involved and
Right,
that.
they're competing for power, not competing ideologically.
No, they're totally in harmony. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Kind of like Hitler and Stalin. It's vying for power, not a
That's a more
ideology.
nuanced conversation, but yeah, they're vying for power. They're vying for, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I know that was an oversimplification, but I think it was a battle of men. But
Yeah.
to go back to the Gestalt thing, the thing I kept thinking about, and
Mm.
this kind of ties in, this is in the Order of Skull and Bones. This whole middle section is on how the order subverted education, and the, he brings up the mother's primer, and this to me is just very much like taking Gestalt and putting it completely out of context. So for those who don't know, the mother's primer was used in Gallaudet, so it was used for the deaf, and it was some people called it the look-see method. And for deaf people, I think it was actually very useful because they can't use phonics. So they can't sound things out and then, piece it together that way. But the idea was that you're taking the whole and you're not breaking down into the parts.
Hmm.
So again, for somebody who's deaf, that might make sense because they don't have the parts to work with. But
Yeah.
for somebody who is hearing, now you're robbing them of their ability to do puzzle making, where you have the pieces and they can figure it out. So I tend to mispronounce things all the time. And I think part of it's because I'm hearing impaired, but part of it is because a lot of what I do is read. So I don't have it like spelled out for me phonetically, but I can figure out even if I see something that I've never seen before, because I was hooked on phonics as a kid, I can piece it together and I can kind of figure it out. They have the building blocks.
Hmm.
So to rob children of that now, I think is devastating. They don't have that opportunity. And it not only does it strip them of their ability to, take something that is unfamiliar to them and figure it out, but I think it actually degrades their critical thinking skills because they don't have the building blocks, the foundational tools. But I feel like that's, in a way, it's kind of this perversion of Gestalt. They're taking something that, the human brain does take a whole, and we can make sense of something that's a whole, but that doesn't mean that you should rob them of the opportunity to have the parts in order to be able to piece them together. But yeah,
Right.
he talks about it was mother's primer was in 1835, and it was Horace Mann who brought it to the masses.
I never heard
And
of that. Yeah. Huh.
yeah, but yeah, they called it look-say reading methods that were developed in 1810 for the deaf mutes and by a truly remarkable man, Gallaudet. And like I said, I think for the deaf, it's very useful, definitely.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
know even myself, I actually just went to an audiologist appointment this morning, and it's always like very scary for me because I was diagnosed as I was born with a hearing impairment, a pretty significant one, but I wasn't diagnosed till I was 6 years old. So I didn't get hearing aids till I was 6 years old. I learned how to speak by reading lips. And so every time I go to this appointment, they have to do hearing tests, and I'm always nervous, knock on wood. It's been stable, my whole life.
Yeah.
But you never know. And I'm always
Yeah.
like, oh my gosh, is it going to be, hopefully there's no change. That's all I want to hear. No change.
Right.
I mean, it'd be great if it gets better, but like you want no change. But I realized even, they do two different types of tests. They do just like the sound frequency test so that they're figuring out where the hearing loss is in different
Yep.
frequencies.
Yep.
But then they also do clarity of speech, right? And I know for myself, sometimes somebody will say something and it'll take me like a few minutes later, I'll piece it together because of the context. I'm like, oh, that's what they said, but I didn't hear it.
Yeah,
So that's what our mind does. That's Gestalt, right? We're
that's
figuring
Gestalt.
out the
Yeah,
context, the whole. But if I didn't have the parts, I wouldn't be able to figure out the whole. So I don't know.
there's
I
definitely
kind of
no,
just felt like
there's
it's relevant to the.
yeah, there's a reciprocity for sure. Like I know that I make limited progress with my Duolingo trying to learn Chinese or Russian. I'm very slow progress, embarrassingly slow. Um and I get a sense that I feel like when I do learn, it's like me memorizing words, but it's not so good at composition. So like
Okay.
uh speaking functionally, whereas when I would go to, let's say, France, I learned French quite like I already had a use of French, but I didn't use it that much. But when I was in France working there for a couple of months, I like got really good at it.
Mhm.
Um, so there's definitely, I think, a bit of both, where you kind of have to associate images and symbolic
Mhm.
words on the one hand, but at the same time, don't just do that, but at the same, think about compositions. And I was thinking about, Helen Keller,
Mhm.
uh, and her autobiography and My Life is so good. And
Mhm.
and her and it's good to like reading both that and Anne Sullivan, her teacher, who also wrote
Mhm.
a autobiography going through the process of discovery, right? This girl
Yeah.
who lost the use of sight and hearing at a young age, a baby, was able to then become somebody who could learn, who knew something like 6 or 7 languages. She was a Shakespeare
Mhm.
scholar. She was a teacher. She was a poet. She really destroyed her life, just destroyed the behavior of school completely. She was like a living demonstration that the whole school of Wilhelm Wundt and the behaviors was wrong.
Yes.
They were trying to pretend she didn't exist.
Yeah.
But her point, like, that she gives is like the thing that woke her up out of her darkness. Because she's like, I lived the life of darkness is like essentially an animal. I was happy to get maybe ice cream, but I didn't have an idea of what ice cream was. I was just happy to get this cold, sweet stuff now and again. And she had like very dark emotions. She would rage very easily because she had no means of expressing herself.
Yep.
And then she describes water being her first, like this person who Anne Sullivan was a Platonist, had a faith that she had a soul that could be awoken. So she had a patience that was superhuman that other people lacked. And at a certain point, Keller describes how she was given this little beautiful doll in the morning and broke it
Yeah.
out of rage. And later on that day is when she had her big eureka, where this had been done already a few times, but Anne Sullivan put her hand under water and like would always try to spell, right,
Mhm.
like WATER into her hand, associated with a thing like teddy bear, and then she'd spell. And it took a long time, but this is it
Yeah.
finally she got it, that there's something to do with this entity called water and this idea I have of it. And all of a sudden, she said it was like a giant flood of discovery and emotion. And the next emotion she had was the sense that there was a being outside of herself that had compassion or love for her. That came directly with the intellectual discovery,
Yeah.
and also shame, because she then could all of a sudden remember what she did by breaking that little beautiful
Mhm.
gift. And she
Mhm.
started crying unbearably because this
Right.
beautiful, and it all kind of, this humanity just rushed on, and then her bell curve was like skyrocketing, where she was just learning like crazy, outpacing everybody else. And it's I see you tearing up a little bit because it's so
Yeah.
beautiful, right? Yeah, me
It's
too.
beautiful.
Yeah.
I
So
played Helen Keller, on stage in New York.
all right
Um,
on.
and it
Oh,
was a very, very difficult role for me. I think, it's a difficult, I think, for many actors because
yeah.
it's a exercise of sensorial deprivation. But for me, it was an exercise of allowing myself to remember a lot of my childhood that I had, purposely, intentionally tried to forget and move past. I spent most of my early childhood, I had a patch over my sighted eye and I didn't have hearing aids.
Oh,
So until I was 6. So I was essentially, I mean, not to the extent that Helen Keller was, but I was, almost blind and deaf every other day of my childhood.
wow.
And so that to remember that and allow, and I relate to the tantrums. you know, my parents actually locked me in my room and you know, I've confronted them about this since I had a babysitter who, like, one day they were gone for like a very short window of time and had a locksmith like switch the lock on the door so that it could be locked from the inside instead of the outside, so I could no longer be locked in my room. But I've talked to my mom about it, and she said that it was because they were worried that I'd be a danger, like to myself or someone, because I was, you know, I would get so frustrated that I would throw a real tantrum.
Right.
And I think it is, you know, you feel trapped if your senses aren't giving you input. You know, you feel you're isolated, but you're also trapped. And it's really interesting you bring up that particular story with all the emotions, because it works both ways, right? We learn in states of heightened emotionality. That's when we have the best memory retention, the best absorption, and ability to comprehend and synthesize information. And this is also, to bring up the social engineers, they actually did studies with this. It's very easy to create like amnesia, you know, to erase memories. That they've actually had tremendous success with that. That's not difficult for them to do. But what they struggled with was to create false memories. However, in a state of stress. So again, that's a heightened emotionality. They're able to implant false memories, and it was something like a very high success rate. They did it with a study of, I think, 900 people, and you know, almost all of them were able to create and implant false memories under stress and trauma.
Wow. So. Yeah. No, there's definitely there's a whole science of mind that the typical person is not allowed to access. Like, we're given the standard models of mind, be it, you know, Freudian, behaviorist, or maybe if you want to be a little bit more of a creative thinker, some Jungian, you know, thinking is permitted. But this like low level stuff, there's a whole other realm, which the oligarchy's been practicing to themselves. I think that's part of the Eleusinian mysteries of the Gnostics. The Gnostics were also rewiring to their own pseudo-Christian sort of effects, is to create situations of crisis, near-death experiences. That's why a lot, I think also the Scientology with their OT 1 to 8, you know, initiation thing involves a lot of young people dying before they get to number 8. Because they're giving people, part of that is the need to give people an authentic near-death experience, sometimes facilitated with some early forms of narcotics, drugs, you know, psilocybin or opium, whatever they have. They were using a variety of altered state inducing chemicals going back to ancient times. That then involves going down into a crypt, going into a dark forest, meeting a beast, having to, like, you know, sometime, or finding yourself at the bottom of a pit. And, you know, you might not get out of it. And because that near-death experience kind of has to be real. Sometimes you can't get out of the box when you wake up and you're at the bottom of the water or something, you know, and people do die. And the ones who do make it through now are trauma-based mind control, like, candidates. Like, at this point, they've got a whole new realm of compartments that have been broken into them. And they can do it to themselves. Like, you read Aleister Crowley's Magic Books of Solomon, or crap on black magic and ritual. And they're like, it's going through the science of how do you take the Kabbalah and like treat the mind in order to break down chambers of the mind using certain exercises and perfumes and ritual along the way that will then induce a certain demon entry from this chamber or another one. And so these people, like, whether it's Crowley intervening with or interfacing with ayahuasca and giving him the, you know, his Thelema thing, or whether it's Carl Jung and his higher initiates, people getting the deep Jungian analysis who pay the $100,000, they get a different experience than your typical low-level person who likes Jung, like maybe Jordan Peterson. I don't think he got the full deal. He doesn't know what the trick is, because Jung is like channeling fucking demon. You know, like he believes he's got like Philemon and Abraxas and all of these demons like actually channeling through him, and nobody can go into his inner chamber at Bollingen. Like, no one's allowed in there. It's crazy ass shit that I'm sure people would find that he did in Bollingen that are all over the walls and everything else. It's a secret chamber. But it involves the need to break the other initiates who are going to be part of the priesthood. They have to be traumatized, broken, remolded, and then they got diffused forms of that for the masses in the form of MK Ultra, and they get more attention to become the Ted Kaczynskis or the Mansons or whatever else. But you know, we all got different variations of the same sort of conditioning, You know, horror movies helped, heavy metal helped, drug culture helped, DMT. Like people think that, oh yeah, my ability to get like to legalize to smoke weed and drop like mushrooms and drop acid and that's my freedom. Like the government, the oligarchy doesn't want me doing those things. It's like that's what the oligarchy's been doing to themselves already, and they want you to do those things. That's why CIA was funding it. It's not your freedom, you know. But people are like fighting for that shit. So
yeah. That's their perception of freedom. But yeah, that was most of what MK Ultra was about, was creating the dissociative personality. So because then you're a much better asset if you don't know what you did in one person. You're compartmentalized. This is like the military is compartmentalized. Well, imagine if you had a human being who's compartmentalized. How much more useful are they?
See, and this is why they hate Edgar Allan Poe. I think, like, I'm doing a whole series right now.
Yeah,
Edgar Allan Poe's Cultural Warrior. But you read some of Poe's works, like I'm doing this study is taking me now into a study of the Jack the Ripper murders from a totally new vantage point. And Poe, in his Imp of the Perverse, especially the Imp of the Perverse short story, he's basically clinically demonstrating what the oligarchical schismed personality is and how it is and why it works and why it's pathetic. He's actually like diagnosing the oligarchy, and they don't like that.
Sure they
he's
don't.
doing that in a few of his pieces. In the Black Cat, he's doing it. He's doing it in The Fall of the House of Usher in its own way as well. Like serious material. Oh, there it is, right there. Yeah, that's the newest one. And the one I'm referring to is going to come out soon. But yeah, Poe is definitely. If people want to understand the stuff we're talking about here, Poe's your man.
Yeah, and Mazzini is in there.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
The whole Young America thing under because the Young America was being created as the Transcendentalists. There was the Northern Scottish Rite branch. Was the Transcendentalists of Ralph Waldo Emerson, which is basically a Gnostic revival.
Yes,
it came later on Theosophy, and then in the Southern branch was the Mithraic revival under Young America Southern Rite, Southern branch, Southern jurisdiction of Albert Pike, of George Saunders, of the B'nai B'rith, that were all co-created at the same time by the same agencies that were managing both schisms. One side was at the heart of the occult revival in the South, that was the Confederacy, the Knights of the Golden Circle, and then in the North was the abolitionists, the radical terrorists, like promoting John Brown to go and just like kill Southerners in the defense of freedom. But they were all, it was to create this civil war, dissolve the Union, recreate two new confederations that would be run by occultists that would be aligned and managed by the British High Command. That was always the thing back then, and it didn't work because luckily people were you had a fortunate number of people who were able to rally around Lincoln and had a better understanding of what Edgar Allan Poe was teaching, and people like him. James Fenimore Cooper is another one. If you read Cooper's writings on the Bravo or The Spy, he's really taking you through a deep analysis of epistemological warfare and the battleground of Venice, how it infiltrated America. Like all of these people who were given like their stories of the last of the Mohicans or something from Hollywood. And no, when you actually read their writings, it's all there. And that was informing the culture, the leadership of the day that was able to properly thus do battle with the thing, which is why, because they were successful, that Theosophy had to be created, because Theosophy would not have been necessary had they have been successful. Neither would the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. It wouldn't have been necessary because they would have achieved their new Aeon of Horus already back in the 1860s.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. And the Transcendentalists, that's interesting, because that's the ultimate of what Maslow was. You know, everybody talks about the self-actualization, the hierarchy of needs, but he was actually really much more focused on being needs, being values, which would lead to transcendence. And the people who were transcendent would be part of the Psychian network. So it's the same thing. It's essentially the same thing. I just think he was pretty naive, but I think he was a good pawn, because his ideas just happened to be right in sync. So, yeah. Well,
super interesting. Right?
Fascinating.
Yeah.
It all seems to lead to the same place. That's what's really, it's just the various nuances and various iterations of the same battles over and over again. But this idea, what were you going to say?
All roads do lead to Rome. It's still the same Roman Empire.
Yeah, that's kind of what it feels like. I don't know. And with different fronts.
Yeah.
Different fronts. Yeah. But I was just going to say with what you were saying with the brain and the different capabilities that we have, and it's I don't know, this idea of how much potential there is, and yet how much has been not just withheld but perverted is so. I don't know. It's a hard thing to kind of wrap your head around because it creates a different schism, right? I think what we see are a lot of as a result, and I think it's understandable. It's a natural kind of emanation. Is this like purity spirals? So there ends up being this idea, well, that anything that came out of a cult or anything that came out of whatever faction you don't like or you've decided is bad, right? This is the splitting, the good, bad, it's all black, it's all white. Then it must be all wrong. It's all just made up and it's all just for nefarious purposes. But I don't think that it would ever work if that were really true. There's elements of truth. Like the example I would use is like CERN. I brought that up, and I do think it was a demonic temple. I mean, that's really what it felt like, and I kind of think it's true. And most of it, when you go in, it sounds very scientific. It's they speak in a lot of science jargon, and there's all these diagrams and models, but when you really look at it, most of it's narrative. There's very little actual science. But there's not none. If there were none, you would just chalk it up to nonsense. It's all make believe. This is just a fantasy land that you walk into, but it's not. There's elements of science there. And that's what seems to be, because otherwise you would just discard it altogether. And I feel like that's kind of the through line. There's always elements of truth, but I think people, they go into one or the other. They want to like jump all in and buy into all of the, the science fiction, or they want to reject it all completely. And I think that's not, I think it's somewhere, there's always the kernel of truth and that is built upon.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great way you're saying it. But like also additionally, like when I was saying earlier on about the Manhattan Project being something which was a secret science program, which couldn't have worked if it didn't utilize real science, but the only people allowed to participate, at least in managerial positions, who were allowed to, because it was very, even though cybernetics was not going to be officially created for another few years. It was created in 1943. Manhattan Project was established a little bit earlier, but it was still already doing it because it was highly compartmentalized. There were hundreds of departments and sub-departments, and it was under the veil of war and secrecy, so no one was allowed to know what the other department was doing. Everyone had a very small task with most of the people working on their task was permitted to know what the part that they were working on was going to be for. Most scientists didn't even know that there was a plan to try to harness the atom and build a bomb. They didn't even know, but a few did. And the ones in executive positions around Oppenheimer typically were, or Leo Szilard was another major one. These were Wellesians. Like Leo Szilard was a devout disciple of H.G. Wells. And they were the initiated class who were allowed to know the higher mechanisms of science, but they were, because they were initiated, they were vetted, they had been groomed and passed the test, right? Where they demonstrated that they had sufficiently been detached from the influence of conscience, of basic human faculties like that, to be permitted that higher realm of knowledge. Things like who was controlling Newton, right? Like the people who were managing Newton, like Samuel Clarke, they were the ones who had set up the Invisible College. The Rosicrucian revival that had really established, it had taken some time, but it really established itself after the British Civil War and with the Glorious Revolution. And that was like full Rosicrucianism, the attempt to blend mysticism and sorcery into science. And that was what they were all doing. So they needed, they were reading Kepler, they were reading Leibniz's works, they were reading the cutting edge discoveries that were being made by real people. So they knew what they were reading this book, but they were reading it with the intention of extracting the the formulaic shell that they could plagiarize and then reinterpret what this is, so that people who would be in managerial positions of science would not understand what it was that made this shell called a formula possible, which was the discovery of the harmonic musicality of the universe, implying the musicality and intention of God, that made us in a certain way that we could discover that thing, right, with a soul,
Right.
that had some parallel quality of recognition that there was a discovery that we had made that we were ignorant of beforehand. So what would allow that eureka aha would mean that there was something in that universal discovery that is similar to what was already inside of us, that we could say, aha, I know, that, which is where Plato's idea of recollection as discovery comes in. That's his idea. It's like a discovery is a future oriented memory or recollection. So it's just a vector. Whereas a recollection of something in the past is just something you've seen before. I lost my book. Now I found it. I see it, and I found it under my couch. And because I've seen it before, I have a memory. I'm like, aha, and I feel like a happiness that I found what I thought was lost. The same feeling can happen, but vectored in the future when we go into the unknown. But we must have something already there within us, in the sense that we must have the reflection of all of the universe somehow embedded in a cloudy way inside of our soul. That's sort of, it doesn't mean that we're taking God's position or helping God. It doesn't mean that. But at the same time, we are.
That's how a lot of people have interpreted it. That's how a lot of people, I mean, we've discussed it, but that's how a lot of people have interpreted Plato, that, he's taking a Gnostic position, that, this is that suddenly it's that they've taken on the position of God within them. And that's why they have that aha moment. But yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It feels good maybe to feel like, aha, I'm God. Like, must be very empowering of a feeling. If you didn't believe that formally, and but yeah, it's the same thing. Like, Plato was bringing about I think an understanding of the nature of mind, which was then utilized by his enemies to take away the actual love of humanity, the ability to honestly pursue self-reflection, agapic love. All of these things were extracted, giving the husk of the shell of like a hierarchy of reality, certain quantized, a sensitivity to the quantization, which was then bastardized in the form of Kabbalistic numerology. I mean, Kabbalism has a functionality in a sense, because it's touching upon the reality of the quantization of physical space-time, which we can all discover, not just a higher priesthood or a mystery, or people who've gone through the mysteries, but they take it and then they put layers of superstition, separating the permitted rate of so-called discoveries that people can make, but they're not real discoveries. They're just memorizing certain rituals in an alchemical. They'll read the Alchemical Wedding by Christian Rosenkreutz, and they'll go through certain rituals of killing a bird on this particular solstice when they're drenched in olive oil, and they're like, whatever. Like, there's all things that they do, and now they're qualified to go to the next level of their so-called epistemological ladder. But it's not really, you didn't earn any of that. There's no discovery anywhere along the way. You were just manipulating things. You're
manipulating public perception of the result of those things.
And then you're doing that. Yeah. And then you're acting like, oh, they must have real science behind them. They must have real knowledge, because look, Newton is a mystical Kabbalist who believes that he's God, and he does believe he's God. He believes so maybe magic actually makes science. And then they create this whole new story of what makes science happen through magic and associated Rosicrucian crap. And then you got, Niels Bohr shaping all of his disciples, who are going out then, drafting the program for what's going to be in the wake of the Manhattan Project. And yeah, they're taking like plasmas and magnetic fields, but they're what they think that they're operating on. They probably think that they're channeling or opening up some gateway to some other dimension. They probably they believe that these dimensions are somehow real, even though they only come from the mathematical formula that were created to justify the Big Bang. Because otherwise, the idea of like multiple dimensions, it's purely a mathematical fiction. It doesn't have reality outside of the math that was needed to justify, well, how did everything happen at that point mass of infinite thing like 13 billion years ago? Well, how did that happen? They had to come up with an explanation. So they're like, well, maybe there's the other dimension
now, but yes.
Huh? And now
They
there's
say
4, right?
14 billion now is
14
what they say.
I
Yeah.
heard it was 18 billion, but okay. Yeah. It's always changing, right? According to
Yeah.
new data. So they're just fudging data and adding maybe like another universe before our universe. And maybe it's but these things were all happening because they were saying, well, our math can say that there was maybe 13 universes or dimensions or 11 dimensions or 39 dimensions. And honestly, it doesn't matter because none of them, if nothing can be proven to be more or less right than anything else. It becomes just blind faith. And what they're trying to do is merge magic and witchcraft in with science to make it seem like witchcraft is science, that there's a science. And a lot of our movies that we're getting, the Harry Potter stuff, the Invisible, like a lot of this stuff is all amplifying that brainwashing to prepare us for this new age of science that's supposed to come out of the big purge, where we are all of a sudden gonna have a new set of gods and aeons and archons that are going to revive under the idea that it's been aliens this whole time, that the government's been withholding information for, but now the disclosure is here, and maybe the Scientologists were right this whole time, and Jesus was an alien and Muhammad was an alien, and
Barbara Marx Hubbard says that Jesus was, well, she's Christ. She says Christ was transhuman. So, so yeah, they're definitely prepping us for that. It's interesting, all this. So I'm, what is this? Oh, 13.7. So almost 14 billion years ago. Yes, that's what they say now. But whatever. It does always change. But I had started reading this, Western mysticism and esotericism, and he differentiates it. I just think this is interesting. He talks about how mysticism and esotericism, it's a compilation of several scholars, but Alexander McGee is the editor, and he wrote Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition, and which is also a fantastic read. But he talks about how mysticism and esotericism are inexorably linked, but that he differentiates between them. And he says that his premise is that mysticism is very ancient, is old, and that esotericism is actually relatively new. And he kind of breaks it down in his intro. And he says mysticism means a kind of knowledge which by very nature is incommunicable. It cannot be directly transmitted. It can be visible only indirectly because its substance cannot be expressed in human language. Esoteric knowledge, on the other hand, means a kind of knowledge that may be communicable and might be communicated, but whose communication is forbidden. And then he goes on to talk about like what encompasses esoteric knowledge, and it's all the like Hermeticism, alchemy, it's Rosicrucianism, but he essentially breaks it down into these like what you were saying. That's why I brought it up. It's essentially like these magic tricks, but they're very formulaic, and that becomes esotericism. And it's more of a methodology as opposed to a intrinsic knowledge. Yeah.
It's interesting because it's like you're dealing,
of course, it's being withheld also. But yeah, sorry, go on.
That's an important factor that he threw in there. Yeah, I have to read the book. I took note of it. I'm going to order it today. Definitely that's something which like Edgar Allan Poe wrote an essay at the end of his life called Eureka, his thoughts on the moral and material universe, dedicated to Alexander von Humboldt. And it's a beautiful essay. And he's directly taking aim at two schools of thought in the first chunk of the essay, which are the thought, and it's taking place 1,000 years in the future, of somebody thinking about the folly of what people believed 1,000 years earlier, like in his own time. So it's a fun little device, to get you out of your comfort zone a little bit and to reevaluate perhaps folly you might also have, that if it was set in your own time, you might not be so willing to accept it. But so he's describing the two paths of knowledge. There it is. That people once believed were the only paths permitted to the mind in pursuing truth, which was the path of creeping and crawling. And the path of creeping he describes as the Baconian, or the method of Hogg, which is the Baconian method, the Hogg, of the a posteriori school of just accumulating sensory data and looking for patterns and then extrapolating patterns into law, which is like not the way a healthy creative mind works. It's pattern formation thinking is like a useful thing you can do, and we should all do it. But to form a judgment from it is irresponsible, and that's the fraud of Bacon, is saying that that's how we discover universals. It's not. And the other that was creeping and crawling would be the what he calls the Aries total. The Aries total spells it Aries, like Aries, the horoscope.
Okay.
Because it's like they've forgotten just basic spelling things 1,000 years in the future. But anyway, and this is the belief in a priori thinking, that you have to start with presumed unquestioned axioms that then you use to impose onto your sensory data as you try to figure things out. And you're relating all of the sensory data to, you're interpreting it according to whatever laws you were given that you can't question. So it's still blind faith.
Right.
And it's like these two paths of creeping and crawling were keeping us from actually making discoveries when the mind's actual yearning is to soar. And he beautifully weaves this tale of which has some profound epistemology to it as far as what a healthy human mind does, which nobody, this is out of, I have a number of Poe collected works volumes. Most of them don't even have this last essay that he wrote before he got killed. And then what they did, his enemies then wrote all of the official autobiographies, even forging letters about him attributed to him to make him seem like he was some opium fiend, death fixated sex fiend. But it was never the man himself. That was always the scarecrow they created for us to remember him as a figure of horror and macabre, and not this beautiful soul that was a real like epistemological warrior. Yes.
Law of perspective.
From Eureka.
Oh, it's from Eureka. Okay.
That's cool. Yeah, because he's getting at he's actually citing Kepler and the origins of the inverse square law. And there you have a geometric expression of what the inverse square law is as far as
how we get perspective.
Yeah, well, it's perspective. It's there it expresses itself in visual perspective as well as in gravitational rates of change. If the influence of gravity fields, the closer to the cause of gravity, let's say the sun, versus the further you move away, the influence being reduced at the inverse square. So it'll be if it's 2 times closer, it'll be 4 times stronger. If it's 2 times further, it'll be 4 times weaker. And so that's a good little. So you got on the bottom the A, B, C, D, E is an arithmetic distancing, whereas the squares of 1 to 4 to 12 to whatever that is, 16 is being 1 to 4 to 9 to 16 is growing geometrically. So it's and that's the inverse square expression of what Newton is plagiarizing. And Kepler takes shots both at Newton, but also translates in that essay Kepler, who knew how to soar. He gets the point across. So very, very important essay. Yeah,
I'll have to look that one up too.
I like to say, but the difficulty of this whole thing is that the communication of a discovery, it's true as soon as you put it into formal words. If you try to you're just appealing to people's memory to so you're not actually getting the essence of the discovery passed on to the student, though you can get the practical functionality of it by, let's say, passing on a symbol tied to a formula, which when applied, the universe will respond accordingly. And a technician can use those things when they're building a dam or building an engineering project and not have knowledge. But it's better when if they're able to somehow replicate the eureka moment that is inexpressible in literal language. But if you read the writings of, let's say, a Plato or a Kepler, they're taking you through the paradoxes of what caused their minds to go like, to short circuit. And then to figure out, they're taking you through what they did to generate resolutions in their writings so that you're equipped to solve the problem yourself, which is why Plato was often leaving the dialogues unanswered fully. He's giving you the tools to answer it yourself, finishing the dialogue. And Kepler is taking you through every single mistake he's making. Because he loves you. He loves us. He wants us. He cares about our minds. And like M. Sullivan,
as if we're children and we were learning. We're in the learning process. So we learn by figuring things out, not by being spoon fed.
Exactly. Yeah. He's like, he respects our minds. And you get that when he's talking to you. And so the thing is, when you have that type of healthy, I guess, classical humanist educational experience that a Max Planck is getting and giving to a Curler and to others, you might create people who will become engineers or technicians who will know their math formulas, but at the same time they will have a freedom to improve upon them and make new discoveries, whereas those who simply memorized will only be able to do the monkey thing and won't have the freedom to make new discoveries.
I'm laughing because when I was in school, I always used to tell my parents that my dad would always talk about like some girl who would get 100 on everything, and I'm like, I'm sure, but if she just memorized it, she can't tell you why shopping has 2 P's. It's a very juvenile way of explaining things the way you said. I totally just remember that.
Oh, that's brilliant. No, that's good. Yeah, that's really great.
Yeah, that's what I would tell my parents.
Yeah.
But it's true. There's a big difference between memorizing something, which will get you so far. Certainly it serves a function and has some value. But if you're able, and this goes right back, I think this goes right back to Gestalt, and also goes back to the whole mother's primer and the look-see. If you're able to integrate and you're able to see the whole picture and understand the why, then if you memorize it as well, that you'll probably do it quicker. You'll make a discovery faster. But you don't actually necessarily need to, because you're piecing things together and you're seeing the whole. Yeah. And I think that that's what there's so much value in. It's really this idea. And that is really the creative genius, I think, of the human brain. I always talk about this study George Land did. It was supposed to be for NASA, but it was where he was looking for creative geniuses. And they did the study starting with 5-year-olds, and they found that 98% of 5-year-olds qualified to be a creative genius, and then they followed them in increments of 5 years. And by the time they got to adulthood, only 2% qualified. And he attributed it to the education system, the modern education system, that was breeding compliance and just deteriorating the creative ingenuity.
Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah, I didn't know about that. Yeah, that's very, I believe it. I believe it. Yeah. So I mean, yeah, like that's the whole thing with like genius is it's become such a mystified term, and I think the Tavistock played a certain role in consciously mystifying it. Like when you look at R.D. Laing, who was also working for Tavistock, was brought into Esalen to lecture there, and part of his thing was to advance this thesis that genius is the flip side of insanity. So if you wanted to be a genius, you had to be crazy as sin. And it's like, well, most people, when confronted with that choice, they'd be like, I'm perfectly happy being like a regular peasant, please. I'd rather not be crazy to be genius. Instead of realizing, and I think that was the dirty sleight of hand, is that no, a healthy mind is, it's just been so few who have been permitted throughout the human experience thus far to actually properly wield this instrument that we have of mind. So they pop out quite a bit. They stand out. Whether it's the Mozarts, the Beethovens, the Poes, the Keplers, the Da Vinci's, they shine. The oligarchy thus has to do extra work to try to redefine what they are, so that we don't actually understand what animated them. So there's all this like these gatekeepers to control our perceptions of them. But at the same time, there's like a real devotion and transparency of the heart, and a transparency in many cases of the mind, of the method, that they want people to be able to. They know that they're not special by any type of hereditary standard. These people know that their talent is hard work. That's a common theme you get. They had to do a lot of self-examination. They were confronted with challenges that very few people are confronted with, but they knew that that everybody could do this. And so they really wanted people to read their original writings and to put into practice in their own context the types of lessons we could extract from their life and from their work. And when you, sure enough, you read the letters of Beethoven, or of, Beethoven, he almost committed suicide, right? When I had read an essay that made a very persuasive case that the same people who had poisoned Mozart a little bit earlier, Mozart wrote to his wife Costanza saying that I'd been poisoned. He knew that he was being poisoned. But that the same thing just simply went awry, and Mozart ended up, Beethoven lost his hearing, right, in both ears. And it didn't take his life, but he almost took his own life, and was writing to his brother saying, I've got no purpose to live. Music was my life. Right. And then he says in that famous letter that he works through it, and he's like, no, I'm going to devote my life to God and to mankind, and I'm going to elevate humanity with music, and that's what I'm going to give myself to, despite not having hearing anymore. And his best, most transformative works happened after he lost his hearing.
Yeah.
Which again, when you know that, and then you revisit and listen to his later musical works, his symphonies, especially his Ninth Symphony and other things, and then you look at the garbage that Hollywood has given us around, like, Immortal Beloved, painting him like he's this schizo abusive jackass genius, or Mozart earlier in Amadeus as this party boy freak fiend who just wants to put his penis into anything with it. And it's like, it's clearly an operation to destroy your ability to properly appreciate the sublime quality of soul that both they had, and that you can also improve upon and awaken in all of our own hearts. We can all tap into that source. And when we do that, we think more like Benjamin Franklin. We start accessing the type of thinking that Lincoln was able to tap into, and Martin Luther King was able to tap into, and John F. Kennedy, and so many others that the oligarchy is afraid of. And that's like a condition for citizenhood. If we want to actually be sovereign citizens, we have to be able to, organize the architecture of our soul the way Plato tried to help us do in his dialogues in the Republic, which requires thinking about, where logic doesn't work to map onto reality. It requires that something extra that can't be communicated. The esotericists are right in that sense, or the mystics are kind of correct. That
Mystics, yeah.
Literally. But at the same time, it is knowable and it is teachable. But
yeah, he does say that it is knowable. It's just that it can't be communicated. Yeah.
It's cool.
R.D. Lang was appointed to senior registrar in 1959 to Tavistock.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
he got in early.
It was early. And Mensa was created, I don't know if it was Tavistock per se, but it was definitely the eugenicists. And they actually, up until pretty recently, they actually had a eugenics page on their website. It was positive eugenics.
Well, they're so elitist, eh? Like, I had my father had a friend who was like this Mensa genius. He passed all these tests, and he had a few of his friends who were all like part of this Mensa society in Montreal.
Right.
And when you talk to these people, they were the most elitist, terrible human beings. There's something that, being excellent at Mensa does to your mind and morals.
Yeah, well, I think part of it is, part of this was a eugenics program, but I think part of it is also, you were talking about how they didn't want people to recognize that they could, through discovery, through hard work, through creative problem solving, that they could achieve genius, which is really what that NASA study proves, is that all human beings have that capacity. Maybe not all, but majority, was 98% of children at the age of 5 had it.
Yeah.
And I think what they're by creating this exclusive members club, it served many purposes, but one of the purposes is, oh, you're not capable. This is for a certain group of people, and it was handed to them, by hereditarily, or whatever, they were of the right bloodline, and they've gotten it, and you're just a plebeian who doesn't have it. But I think it also was a way for them to these kind of testing were also a breeding ground for them to groom various change agents and assets and that sort of thing. But it was also a eugenics club, so it served many purposes for them. But the moral of the story is that apparently it's accessible to a lot more people. This is why I'm doing day one on education, because I do think that our education system, even Charlotte in the beginning of her book, she does like a definition of the two types of education, and how they change the definition. I don't know if I could probably find it.
Hey, Charlotte,
Iserbyt.
Who?
Charlotte Iserbyt. She was a whistleblower under the Reagan administration. She blew the whistle on the BEST project, which was essentially the tech ed. She's the one who calls Common Core Communist Core.
Okay.
Which is very appropriate. You know, Common Core was derived from the World Core curriculum, which was Robert Mueller, and it was part of his like a 2,000 idea that became 7,000 ideas. He had a lot of visions, but he said that the future of education would be breeding global citizens, and he said it would be based on the works of Alice Bailey, her ascended master Joao Kuhl, and Kuthumi, which was the ascended master supposedly from Madame Blavatsky. And of course, it was also based on the ideas of Teilhard de Chardin. So he was very, you know, he believed in, he coined the term planetics. And I actually did a show where I read from his 2,000 ideas, and it was something like, I don't know, like 20 just that I found off the you know, just skimming it, where he says planetics, and that's his vision for the future.
I watched that show. That was, yeah, that was good. Yeah.
Planetics. But yeah, she talked about it. It's only within 10 years, or less than 10-year difference. So in 1927, the definition of education was the drawing out of a person's innate talents, abilities by imparting the knowledge of languages, scientific reasoning, history, literature, rhetoric, etc. The challenge through which those abilities would flourish and serve. So, I mean, essentially, it's this idea that you're giving them foundational tools which they can discover their innate, you know, and enhance their innate abilities, and hopefully, you know, go on to expand that, you know. But you're giving them foundational tools that are going to help them to flourish and serve. Yeah. Then in just 1934, so it's less than a decade later, this is what the definition of education becomes. This is according to what was it? An Outline of Educational Psychology, Barnes & Noble, New York, 1934. And so this says, learning is the result of modifiability in the paths of neural conduction. Explanations of even such forms of learning as abstraction and generalization demand of the neurons only growth, excitability, conductivity, and modifiability. The mind is the connection system of man, and learning is the process of connecting. The situation response formula is adequate to cover learning of any sort, and the really influential factors in learning are readiness of the neurons, sequence in time, belongingness, and satisfying consequences.
Oh my God. That's hilarious. That's so cybernetics. It's human machines.
I know, transhumanism.
Or
I mean,
hedonist machines. Yeah, like machines that just want to have
yeah.
some pleasure. Yeah.
So like, wow. That's not a foreshadowing, but yeah. So
yeah.
Well, I've kept you a while. I appreciate it. This was fascinating and really fun. So thank you. If you have anything else you want to add and wind down with, and of course, I'll see where they can find you.
This was a blast. Yeah, this is good for the soul, and really appreciate these chats, Courtney. Like this is high quality, edifying for me. I get a lot out of this, and I hope people watching were able to also make a few eurekas along the way. And certainly, yeah, what's being shown there is my Substack. It's kind of my lifeline these days. So Substack is something that I do pretty often.
You are super prolific. I can barely keep up. I don't know how you do the depth of work you do as often as you do it.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah.
And this is the more educational, cultural platform that Cynthia and I created a while ago called the Rising Tide Foundation. And that's risingtidefoundation.net. Full of all sorts of content. We host, lectures every week. We're actually gearing up for, we're going to be doing something on avoiding World War III lecture series, bringing in some experts over the course of a couple of months. We'll offer a little certificate course for that too. People can do little homework assignments, and that's going to start next month. And if people want to get involved with that, just go to, I guess we'll have a page set up for registration. And I guess the books, if people want to like dig in a little bit more deeply, especially to the science conversation we just had today, that's my history books. It's volume 1 to 4 of the Clash of the Two Americas. And I did sort of like an informal volume 5 in the form of the, Science Unshackled, restoring causality to a world of chaos. Which is small, but it gets at the Darwin subversion of biological science and Chardin and cybernetics and all sorts of stuff, and a lot of Plato. So anyway, that's also available on CanadianPatriot.org. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff there. Oh yeah, Twitter's a thing too.
Awesome. Well,
Yeah.
thank you. Yeah. And we'll post all the links for all of that so people can find it.
Thank
So,
you, Courtney. All right. And good luck with the, no, you don't need good luck, but have fun at the upcoming conference. It looks exciting. And yeah, I'll be spreading the word too.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Right.
Yeah, that's cognitiveliberityconference.com. Yep. August 16th, 17th. And it should be awesome. So thank you all for watching and listening. And thank you.